Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Depending on where you are and from which traditional territory you're able to join in, and for the second day of the National Forum on the Federal Legislation on C15. My name is Harold Tarbell, from Kwazasti, and will be serving as your co-chair, and I'm joined by Wina Siwi and Cedric Gray-Lahoy as our co-chairs. I'm going to turn, just to get us going here, we will turn it very quickly over to Cedric to just reflect briefly on yesterday's meeting. We'll review the agenda, and then we'll turn it over to Wina to remind us of our guidelines for the webinar forum and to lead us into our first presentation from Minister of Justice, David Lametti. Cedric?
Thank you, Harold. So good morning, everyone. I hope you all rested up. It was a good day yesterday and going to be another good one today. So as the co-chairs, the facilitators, we were thinking about how can we summarize day one? And we thought about it by two different ways. First one is process. So issues were brought up with process regarding the regional consultations, the regional approaches to making a position for C15, the parliamentary process and how we've been implicated in not as First Nations people, and also how the AFN, we spoke about what happened at the AGA, but also about going forward, what are the next steps. So we wanted to start thinking about that and keep that in mind today as we're going forward and thinking, well, how can we make this the best process going forward? And today, again, first step is trying to speak with one another, having an open dialogue and making sure that the ideas get out there, that we can hear the for, the against, the improvements that are proposed, so that in the end, as independent nations, you guys can make the best decisions possible. And the second one is for content. It's a law, so it's obviously a lot of content. The differences between the preamble, the articles, but also what's maybe missing within C15. So once again, keep that in mind when you're giving your interventions today. Let's try to see how we can make this the best possible approach. And again, giving that power to you guys so that you can make your own informed decisions. Excited to see what happens today, and I'll be passing the mic on to Wina.
Thank you very much for that, Cedric. Again, just as a reminder, the agenda before Wina takes over here is we will hear from Minister Lametti. There will be a dialogue session with him. Following that, we will hear a video presentation from Premier Horgan, and we will be joined live by Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, Murray Rankin, who will also provide remarks and then be present for the Q&A with the leadership at that point. And then the remainder of our day from there is really a plenary dialogue around these issues and views that need to be shared and ideas which can be considered for going forward. And then we are scheduled to turn to the National Chief for closing remarks at 4:45 p.m. today, and the knowledge keepers from the AFN Elders Council will help us with the closing at that point. Over to you, Wina.
Merci, Harold. Merci, Cédric. Bonjour, Koué. Merci d'être ici aujourd'hui pour cette deuxième journée d'un dialogue national très important. Et justement, à travers ce dialogue, on ressent bien la force et le feu sacré des dirigeants des Premières Nations. Et cela a probablement quelque chose à voir avec le respect mutuel et l'incroyable et belle diversité de nos peuples. Plusieurs points nous rassemblent, nous l'avons compris hier au cours du dialogue. Et si ce n'est que de vouloir faire tout en notre pouvoir pour regarder demain et l'adresser la tête haute et le dos droit dans le respect de nos ancêtres. Mais il y a aussi une diversité, comme on disait. Alors, la diversité doit s'exprimer et elle s'exprime notamment au comment y arriver, par quels moyens y arriver, quel véhicule utiliser, quel changement on devrait apporter. Et pour connaître cette diversité de points de vue, on souhaite vous entendre, c'est l'occasion aujourd'hui, puis c'est pour ça qu'on est réunis aujourd'hui. On souhaite entendre les perspectives de gens ou de dirigeants des Premières Nations qu'on a peut-être moins souvent l'occasion d'entendre. Ça peut être les régions, ça peut être une perspective de genre, ça peut être une perspective de langue. On a l'anglais, le français, on n'a pas entendu de français, on n'a pas beaucoup entendu les régions de l'Est, on n'a pas beaucoup entendu de voix plutôt de voix des jeunes. Alors, on vous encourage, on est ici pour ça, puis c'est ce qu'on souhaite. On a beaucoup de temps devant nous, on en a eu beaucoup hier, on en a encore beaucoup aujourd'hui, et on veut en profiter, maximiser notre rencontre. Alors, c'est important de prendre la parole, mais c'est aussi important d'écouter ce que l'autre après nous a à dire. Et c'est pour ça qu'on a été obligé de fixer un temps. Le temps était 3 minutes pour chaque intervention. C'est important parce que c'est notre façon, quand on s'exprime, de respecter l'autre qui vient après pour que tout le monde puisse avoir le temps de s'exprimer aujourd'hui. Tous ceux qui le souhaitent, en tout cas. Alors, je vous souhaite un excellent dialogue à toutes et à tous. Et j'arrive maintenant à notre premier invité de la journée, l'honorable David Lametti. C'est le ministre de la Justice et le procureur général du Canada qui, dans sa lettre du premier ministre, s'est vu confier la responsabilité de déposer un projet de loi pour mettre en œuvre la Déclaration des Nations unies avant la fin 2020. Le ministre Lametti fera une présentation de 15 minutes et cela va être suivi d'un dialogue de 20 minutes. Alors, ça sera une occasion de pouvoir échanger, poser vos questions au ministre. Alors, accueillons maintenant Monsieur le ministre Lametti. Monsieur le ministre, à vous la parole, si vous êtes présent.
I think we should just start with our knowledge speaker to open up the day in a good way.
Oh, je croyais qu'il n'y avait pas de... Sorry, je croyais qu'il n'y avait pas de prière d'ouverture ce matin. C'est ce qu'on m'avait dit ce matin. Alors, c'est les joies du live. On vous a réservé une surprise. Alors, avant d'entendre Monsieur le ministre Lametti, nous allons maintenant passer la parole à notre gardien du savoir et aîné, Mike Mitchell. To you, Elder Mitchell.
Yeah, well, we had a real good session yesterday, and we started the day by acknowledging Mother Earth, all of creation, every single element in our Thanksgiving up to as far as the land of the Creator. And I said this in English, and then I repeated in my own language in Mohawk. And we closed off the meeting in Ojibwe with the same words by Elder Roberta. So today I'm going to reopen this meeting and say the same. But I also want to point out that as part of that opening, we were mindful to be kind and courteous to one another. And of all the concerns and ideas that we may have regarding Indigenous rights, survival, governance, etc., the only way that we can make gains is keep our ancestors in mind and our Creator for everything that we have, that we be kind to one another. We can even disagree on points, but that's a focus of having respect. And that's the nucleus of my opening today, is to give that respect to Mother Earth and continue on to the waters and the land and tree, animal life, bird life, Grandmother Moon, Elder Brother Sun, beyond stars and onto the heavens. And each one, as we say in our own language, we're very careful to give honor and respect. So I'm going to give a very fast version of everything I just said in English, because my grandfather always said, the Creator wants us to speak the language that He has given us. And in communication with nature, with the environment, with the spirit world, we must carry that. And so I'll say the few words in my language just to let them know on behalf of everyone that our language are important to us. Negadinua, Monisalade, Neniogueda, Hondoagadaloruk, Neaduagerota, Tachidoan Horado, Nesawayadis. Tanadoyalane, Genoedi Walashi de Gosara, then and there, Yetinadon, Yetinistan, Jum Jad. Tane no way, Niganigarunia. Any no way, Kanoquatsura, Yugiloto, Kaya, Tanadam Haki, Uji to Hoguma, Yichina Ragun, Yikiadan Rodani. Tane, you already guided the Gawalag, Yetisa Togun, La Duelas. Anje tiwanal ko nagugo sa dinohare ti honjat. Eni ni ore tegin de gara paraska ti sot. Asotane ka gara ko tanaska ti dawachia. Kyuke ne kanane gara. One jistano kwa sumani dawachka to sti ko tanghake. Asotane kanagwa. Agwego he wadiyandare. Tenegari he wanakde ti honjade gechko. Odawachka we kanumara dunsara. Unagadi hedo ojinori se honjade nesa we adis. Odawayara tachi doan harad. Agwego and yo so na hodana nei what's so hake tenegari she wanakde. Unjagde wadan hake. Nagadi agwego skani guna yoni. Echino harada agwego naitonage ne agwani gon. We start by acknowledging each other, those of us that have gathered here this afternoon. And we also remember to offer kind words to Mother Earth and all of creation that is part, the waters, the land, the tree life, animal life, the wind birds, the four winds, the two moons, grandmother moon, elder brother sun, and the stars and beyond. What the elders will say, the land of the Creator. And all these things that we have in our time that we spend on earth. Our elders will always remind us to be grateful for the life that we have. And always have respect for one another when we gather. And always use the kindest words we can to have respect in our meetings so that people will understand what we need to say and they carry those words in their hearts. And so today we offer those words in our language and we give an interpretation in English so that we can share with one another what our elders have always taught us. And that's respect everything, from the land all the way to the heavens. And with that, today, as yesterday, we had a real good meeting. Some good ideas, some good responses, some good discussions took place. We want to carry that on today. Everyone that is participating, everyone's thoughts is important. And so we give thanks to everyone for offering themselves, their minds, their thoughts on where we go as Indigenous people, going into the future, our governance, our Indigenous rights, all these things that we have in common going forward is our discussion for the day. So we thank all of you for coming out, sitting in our council fire. The meeting is now open. Tony Gawanage, and you, don't like you. Doneto.
Merci, Annie Mitchell. Thank you, Elder Mitchell, Knowledge Keeper. Alors, comme on attend la présence de notre premier invité, nous allons revoir un peu, maintenant que j'ai pu me pratiquer, on va pouvoir revenir et faire une présentation officielle. Je voulais revenir un peu sur les règles ou des guidelines qu'on a un peu établies pour s'assurer, l'objectif, c'est vraiment de s'assurer qu'un maximum de personnes peuvent s'exprimer aujourd'hui. Alors, comme je parle en ce moment, je vois que monsieur le ministre est arrivé. Alors, je vais immédiatement, pour lui donner tout le temps possible et pour vous donner tout le temps possible de dialoguer, j'aimerais maintenant accueillir le ministre Lametti, l'honorable David Lametti, le ministre de la Justice et procureur général du Canada, qui va s'entretenir avec vous. Alors, monsieur le ministre, à vous.
Merci, Madame Siwi. Hello, bonjour, Kwe. Greetings from my office, which sits on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people, here where I am sitting in Ottawa. I would also like to offer my thanks to Knowledge Keeper Mike Mitchell for helping open these dialogues in a good way yesterday. So Mike, Niawan. I am pleased to join the AFN's National Leadership Forum to discuss Bill C15, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. C'est avec plaisir que j'ai reçu plusieurs invitations pour discuter du projet de loi C15 avec des organisations autochtones, des juristes et académiques des représentants d'industrie et plusieurs autres, incluant une discussion avec vous, la première depuis la présentation du projet de loi. J'essaie de saisir chaque opportunité de participer au dialogue sur la déclaration et je prévois participer à ces discussions chaque fois que j'en ai l'occasion. It's an honor to be part of an event with Chief Dr. Wilton Littlechild, and with my former colleague, Romeo Saganash. These exceptional leaders continue to play a pivotal role in making the declaration a reality in Canada. Thank you both for setting the stage with your great overview of the declaration. A shout out also to another old friend and academic colleague, Professor Sakaj Henderson. C15 is built upon decades of work, both internationally and here in Canada. It offers us the opportunity to deliver on the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls for justice set out in the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. It offers us an opportunity to improve how we work together to build a better future. Before we get into our dialogue, I want to touch on some key points of Bill C15 and its role in the work to advance reconciliation and tackle deep-rooted discrimination and racism. This reality goes to the heart of the bill and the declaration itself. It's about implementing a framework for a profound change in the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. It's about human rights. It's about upholding human rights, affirming self-determination, closing socioeconomic gaps, combating discrimination, and eliminating systemic barriers and systemic racism facing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I know there's a significant interest and high expectations about Bill C15's implementation from Indigenous peoples and indeed from all sectors of society. I understand the desire for concrete timelines and firm assurances of meaningful and structural change. These are complex and multifaceted challenges that will take time, hard work, collaboration, and patience. But we are seeing tangible progress and the momentum that we can build and momentum that we can build on as we move together, forward together. For example, our government isn't waiting for the royal assent of Bill C15 to make fundamental changes that contribute to the implementation of the declaration. As you know, in 2019, we worked together to enact new laws to support the reclamation and revitalization of Indigenous languages and to affirm and recognize Indigenous jurisdiction over child and family services. We also passed legislation to improve Indigenous participation in environmental impact assessments and other regulatory processes. These bills and others include express references to the declaration. Bill C15 will further act as a catalyst to build on this process. There are Canadian laws, policies, and programs that already reflect elements of the declaration. This includes Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 and many provisions of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, notably Section 15 on equality rights. And this also includes the non-discrimination protections provided by the Canadian Human Rights Act. Cela dit, malgré le progrès que nous avons accompli ensemble dans les dernières années, je sais qu'il y a encore beaucoup de travail à faire. Je crois sincèrement que le projet de loi C15 est un grand pas dans la bonne direction. Nous avons bâti C15 sur la fondation de l'ancien projet de loi C262, déposé par Romeo Saganash, en incluant les voix et tous ceux impliqués dans son développement. Those voices contributed to strong legislation that will guide us in the full and effective implementation of the Declaration in Canada and contribute to reconciliation and renewed Crown Indigenous relationships. Again, I believe this, building on this foundation that was laid by Romeo and Wilton Littlechild and others, allows us to move this conversation and move progress on reconciliation in the right direction. Thanks to your contributions, the new preamble to the bill is particularly important to advance the goal of reconciliation. It includes new language to highlight the positive contributions the Declaration can make to healing and peace, as well as harmonious and cooperative relations in Canada. It includes new language to recognize the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. It includes language to reflect the importance of respecting treaties and agreements. It includes language to highlight the connection between the Declaration and sustainable development and climate change. And it includes language to emphasize the importance of taking into account the diversity of Indigenous peoples in implementing legislation. Full and meaningful implementation of the Declaration will require action from the provinces, territories, and municipal governments. And we are ready to work with all levels of government, Indigenous peoples, and other sectors of society in order to achieve the Declaration's goals. The bill also includes a provision that the Act is to be understood as upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution, and not as abrogating or derogating from them. There's no freezing of rights here. Like similar non-derogation clauses in other federal legislation and consistent with the recommendations of a Senate committee, this provision underscores that nothing in Bill C15 reduces the constitutional protection of Aboriginal and treaty rights. Let me be clear. This provision does not seek to reinterpret or amend the rights in the Declaration itself. Rather, it confirms that in taking measures to implement the Declaration, such measures cannot be used to abrogate or derogate from constitutionally protected Section 35 rights, and this includes treaty rights. I would like to acknowledge the importance of treaty relationships in this process. Where they exist, treaties are the foundation of relations between First Nations and the Crown. The implementation of the Declaration at the federal level will not change these relationships. Rather, it will help hold the Government of Canada to a higher level of accountability in relation to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties. Article 37(2) of the Declaration itself specifically notes that nothing in the Declaration may be interpreted as diminishing or eliminating the rights of Indigenous peoples contained in treaties, agreements, or other constructive arrangements. The bill also includes a purpose clause to affirm the Declaration as a universal international human rights instrument with application in Canadian law. This recognizes that the human rights standards set out in the Declaration can provide relevant and persuasive guidance to officials and courts. The purpose clause also recognizes that the bill provides a framework to guide implementation of the Declaration by the Government of Canada. This means that it sets out the essential supporting commitments and structures for federal efforts to implement the Declaration moving forward. Most importantly, it requires the Government of Canada to work in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. Parlons un instant du plan d'action. Le plan d'action sera développé et mis en place en partenariat avec les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis. Il inclura des mesures pour lutter contre les injustices et les préjudices, éliminer toutes les formes de violence et de discrimination et racisme systémique, et pour promouvoir le respect, la compréhension et les bonnes relations. It will address monitoring, oversight, recourse or remedy, and other accountability with respect to the implementation of the Declaration. The action plan will also include measures for review and amendments. Finally, before I turn it over to questions from all of you, I want to address the issue of free, prior, and informed consent. We know there are questions and concerns on how this would be interpreted in the Canadian context. I'm confident we can build a shared understanding of this important concept through open and honest dialogue. Events like today's can contribute to this dialogue and help to set the foundation for collaboration. From Canada's perspective, free, prior, and informed consent is about self-determination, respectful two-way dialogue, and meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in decisions that affect you, your communities, and your territories. And as my colleague Minister Bennett says, that's from the get-go. As we work to implement the Declaration federally and uphold Indigenous peoples' inherent right to self-determination, we will help develop a stronger, more sustainable path for Indigenous peoples, the Government of Canada, and indeed all Canadians. As I said at the outset, Bill C15 and the Declaration are fundamental to our broader work to advance reconciliation and tackle deep-rooted discrimination and racism in all parts of society. This is a top priority for the government and for me personally as Minister of Justice. We've pledged to make changes that are informed by the lived experience of racialized communities and of Indigenous peoples. Bill C15 is another step along this path to advance self-determination, close socioeconomic gaps, and eliminate systemic barriers facing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Une approche basée sur l'ouverture et le respect de chacun nous a permis d'arriver jusqu'ici. Nous devons, en tant que partenaires et amis, continuer dans cette voie de dialogue et de confiance. Je sais que ce sont nos actions qui nous permettront de bâtir cette confiance. Comme je l'ai dit à plusieurs reprises, le projet de loi C15 n'est pas une fait accomplie. Our collaboration and engagement will continue as this bill goes through Parliament. We are open to amendments, and we welcome and encourage your continued input. I've said from the beginning that the tabling in the House of Commons was a step in the process, and that collaboration and consultation would happen before that and would continue after that. And so I'm here with you today. Panel discussions like this one will help feed into this process. I am ready and willing to have the difficult and important conversations that need to take place. And I look forward to listening to what you have to say about the legislation and the next steps. Thank you. Merci. Magwech. I look forward to your questions.
Merci, Monsieur le ministre Lametti. Je vais maintenant donner la parole à mon collègue Cédric qui va être avec vous pour faciliter la période d'échange. Cédric, à toi.
Thank you very much, Amina. Good afternoon, Minister Lametti. Thank you for being here. Just to remind people of the process, so we ask that you use the raised hand function, which is at the bottom of your screen, to get onto the speakers list. I see we already have some that are up. And also don't forget that the interpretation tab is also there. So some questions might be in French or in English. So just for you guys, 3 minutes per question, and the process will be 2 questions, and then we'll go towards the minister for his answer. So to start us off, I will bring Regional Chief Roseanne Archibald from Ontario. Or see Archibald, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Cedric. Again, I'm not able to turn on my camera, unfortunately, but I do have just one question for Minister Lametti. You did hear from some of our leadership yesterday talking about not having enough engagement and opportunities to discuss C15 in Ontario. And in fact, we have submitted a budget to you, Minister Lametti, for $140,000. And we did have our own session in Ontario that with our own resources on January 12th, we had Wilton Littlechild join us, as well as Regional Chief Terry Teegee. It was a good session, but again, all done without the funding from your department. This is a reasonable small amount in order for our chiefs to be properly engaged in the process, and also for them to participate in the parliamentary process and to ensure that we have the capacity to do that. And so that's my question is, why have you, number one, been less than engaging in terms of being in the regions for engagement? And where is the status of our 140,000? I was told by our staff just this afternoon that there's been a lot of back and forth on it. But Minister, if we're going to get through this process together, then we do need the proper resources to do that. Thank you very much. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Regional Chief Archibald. Our next speaker will be Chief Wilfred King. As he arrives to the mic. Chief King, the microphone is yours.
Good afternoon, Chief Wilfred King, Kiasaging Anishinabek, Gulbe First Nation. My question is for Minister Lametti, and my question is, it sounds very good, very promising that we're having UNDRIP C15, that we're going to work on it. However, I have a real fundamental concern. And that concern is right now, and I understand that you cannot answer this question because we're involved in active litigation, and I understand your position as minister. But however, for the sake of this forum, Gull Bay First Nation has filed a statement of claim. Right now, we're in mediation with 3 other First Nations and Gull Bay. And this litigation goes back 170 years. We've been waiting for 170 years for a just result to our claim. So I'm not comfortable right now when we're sitting at the table with your government, your party, and yet there's been very little movement in terms of that process. So I can't reconcile how you can sit here and state that UNDRIP C15 is going to advance Aboriginal treaty rights such as the treaty rights under Section 35 are going to be advanced under UNDRIP, when right now, as we're speaking, your government is failing to recognize a long outstanding treaty obligation, a legal obligation to ensure that our First Nation has a just results for our litigation. So I can't reconcile that. I'm sorry, sir. You know, I'm in favor of UNDRIP C15, but right now I cannot see how we can move UNDRIP unless your government is willing to start dealing with First Nations that have these long outstanding claims. That's not much of a question. I know you can't answer it, but I think it just, from my perspective, it's a statement, and I would like some sort of clarification.
Thank you, Chief King. I'll remind participants before we go to Minister Lametti for answers and comments, you can use the raise hand function to get onto the speakers list, or else we have the Q&A section that you can write down your questions and we, the facilitators, can bring them up to Minister Lametti. Minister Lametti?
Yes, merci, Cedric. I'll start with Chief King first. Look, I understand your discomfort and your position. You're correct to say I can't comment on the litigation. I will say that I'm building upon what my predecessor, Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, did with the litigation directive about how the government engages with Indigenous peoples in the court system. And I have the support of Minister Miller, Minister Bennett, and others as we push forward. It is a bit like UNDRIP and like trying to dismantle the vestiges of colonialism. It's a step-by-step, inch by inch, foot by foot, mile by mile process, and we keep working at it. I do want to say there is good faith on our part in trying to get to mediated answers on all of these questions, even if it doesn't look like it all the time. And so all I can say is I'm sorry. I understand the way you feel, and we are trying to do our best as a government to change the attitudes that have gotten us here. And I'm pleased that you support C15 in principle, because I do really sincerely believe that C15, again, building on the work of Willie Littlechild and Sackage Henderson and others, and building on the bill that Romeo Saganash presented, I think it does get us to a better place. It's not perfect, but I think it does get us to a better place. It's not a perfect relationship, but we need to make it better, and I think C15 helps. Chief Archibald, I understand the concern. We're going to continue to remain in dialogue. I know that we have reached out to the Chiefs of Ontario for further technical briefings and dialogues. I know that funding is being assessed by my colleague Minister Bennett at CERNA with respect to your specific request. And I'm sorry I don't have an answer, but I do understand the importance of having resources to participate in these processes. And as I've said from the beginning, I'm in a minority parliament situation. We thought it was best to get this thing back in front of the House of Commons as soon as possible, and have it as a government bill in order to avoid the fate of Romeo's bill in the Senate, where it was deprioritized by a small group of senators on the excuse that it was a private member's bill. So we wanted to get it forward quickly, and we did as much consultation as we could before tabling, and we're continuing with consultation and dialogue, technical discussions, thinking about amendments as we move forward. It's always been part of a step-by-step process, and we're just going to continue to work at it and speak with as many regional, in particular regional leadership groups as we can, and continue to move it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Lametti. We have a few questions that were written by our members. The first one from Dan Bellegarde from Saskatchewan, saying that the Premier of Saskatchewan and others have written letters of protest against the introduction of Bill C15, and wondering what Canada's response and your response would be to that. And for a second one, we have Joel Abram from Ontario, who is asking about what you foresee the government committing to renunciate the doctrine of discovery and any related policies, such as the inherent rights policy, the Indian Act claims policy, non-assertion technique policy, that are at the root of colonialism. The mic is yours.
Thank you very much. Great questions. First of all, to Dan Bellegarde's question, there were a number of premiers who expressed their opinions at a First Nations at a First Ministers meeting. We had and then by letter. I have responded in the context of the First Nations meeting with prepared remarks, addressing all the points raised in that letter. I can say that the leadership of national Indigenous organizations, including National Chief Bellegarde, were invited to present to First Ministers, and I think forcefully advanced the argument on a number of points. I believe that I'm in fundamental disagreement. I think our government is in fundamental disagreement. I think other provincial governments and territorial governments are in fundamental disagreement with the position taken by these premiers. First of all, just generally, the Declaration's been around for a long time. Romeo Saganash's private members bill has been around since 2016. We flagged two First Ministers in January of 2020. I flagged personally at a First Ministers meeting, and we invited national Indigenous leadership, including National Chief Bellegarde, to that meeting. We flagged that we were going to go ahead with this in January 2020, and we are doing so in the way that treaties and declarations from the United Nations are traditionally introduced in the House of Commons. And so there are no surprises here. We're working within, in partnership with you, obviously, but within areas of federal jurisdiction. And so a number of the positions that they raised, I'm in fundamental disagreement with, and I have made that clear. Chief Abrams, thank you. Good to speak with you again. You know that I have said on a number of different occasions that in 20 years of teaching property law, I always took the time and made the effort to debunk theories such as terra nullius and discovery, and show how fundamentally wrong they were conceptually, and I'm committed to that personally. We're open to amendments in this process, as you know, and I know there have been a number of suggested amendments in this regard. With respect to colonialism more generally, look, we know we have 150 plus, over that, 200 plus years of colonial history in Canada with colonial structures, and we need to dismantle the attitude, and we need to dismantle as many of those structures as we can. It's a step-by-step process. Is under a perfect? No. But does it get us to a better place than we were yesterday? Yes, I think it does. And does it help us to advance those discussions about dismantling colonialism piece by piece? Yes, I think it does. And I commit to do my best to working with you as we move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Our next speaker will be Chief Mel Hardy. Chief Hardy, if you can open your camera.
Good afternoon, I'm here. Yep. Bonjour. Zongezi de Goma, Cork to Olympic Gizagi, Nishnabik Donjubi. Rocky Bay First Nation. Good afternoon, Minister. Guess I've got kind of a I listened to your opening. I thank you for attending today in your words, your opening words, comments. And I've heard what the other chief says. You know, when we talk about, you had mentioned that the action plan will in partnership with First Nations. I'm hoping that the discussions will be with First Nations, who's the rights holders, as opposed to having the designation be for Aboriginal organizations to, as much as they advocate, but the First Nations do have to be involved. And my fear is that that'll get lost. And I'd like to see that happen, that First Nation actually has a say in the table, because that's what it comes down to. The other thing is, there was a competition regarding policy options, and the first runner-up, Brian Bird, had captures the essence of Aboriginal rights in the Canadian constitutional tradition. And it's pretty basic. What it's saying is that until 1982, Section 9124 was only a reference to Aboriginal peoples of Canada in the Canadian Constitution. The enactment of Section 35(1) of the Constitution 1982 recognized and affirmed the Aboriginal treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada existing in 1982. The Supreme Court of Canada first addressed the relationship between 9124 and Section 35(1) in the 1990 decision R versus Sparrow, acknowledging the exclusive federal power to legislate in relation to Indians and lands reserved for Indians continued after 1882 or 1982. The Supreme Court of Canada held that the power must, however, now be read together at 35.1. This requirement led the court to acknowledge that Section 31 mandates the power of the federal government pursuant to Section 924 be reconciled with the federal duty to act in the fiduciary responsibility relationship with the respect to Aboriginal people that is trust-like rather than adversarial. Why I'm pointing that out to you, it was a word, because of the fact that the Supreme Court of Canada did lay the law down, is when we're having challenges, and I heard Chief Wilfred King mention that about the treaties and Aboriginal organizations and how they have impact on our treaty rights as well. But more so, and we talk about our housing file, not having the land exclusively to build on, because the ATR and the LLB process is tying us up. We're unable to build on lands. And this is true, a treaty process. You mentioned treaty negotiations. What can your office do to alleviate the holdup of the ATR and LLB process, so we can move and start development on those lands that's being designated to our First Nation? We got you.
Thank you, Chief Hardy. Our second speaker will be Judith Sayers. And then we'll go back to Minister Lametti for a response. Judith Sayers.
Okay, thank you. Takes a minute to get on. Good to see you, Minister Lametti. I wanted to follow up on one of the points that you made today, and that was with regard to free, prior, and informed consent, which is vital to us as First Nations people in order to protect our territories. And, you know, you're very positive about coming to some agreement, but, you know, we hear from the Prime Minister and here in BC from the Premier and Minister of Indigenous Relations that it does not mean a veto, but I'm not sure what consent means if it's not yes or no. But I just wanted to make the point that, you know, it will be a challenge for us to come to an agreement, but I don't think the right of free, prior, and informed consent and the development over our territories can be read by itself, because there are many sections in the declaration that talk about our right to own, manage, and use resources in our territory. And I think if we own the land, then, you know, we have the consent. Also, one of the more important articles, of course, is that we need to have a relationship with our land and waters and resources. And if we don't have the right to development, to say yes or no to development, those areas can be destroyed, and our relationship also will be destroyed. Also the right to participate in the decision-making processes. Those are just some of the sections that I think need to be read in conjunction. And of course, the right to self-determination, which allows us to freely pursue our economic, social, and cultural development, which is the key foundation principle to everything that is here. So I look, I really would love to see us sit down and have some meaningful discussions about what this means, to give us comfort that, if the federal government is for sure, implementing this declaration with the right spirit and intent, then how can we actually come to an agreement on free, prior, and informed consent? So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sayers.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Let me start with Judith Sayers. Good to see you again virtually. To me, free, prior, and informed consent isn't simply about resources. It's about the relationship that we have between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, as one being consensual and informed and in partnership. And so that's a larger challenge. And as you rightly point out, it touches upon all the other aspects of the declaration and about our relationship. And we need to frankly just get it better. Because it hasn't been done in the past, and that's one of the real vestiges of colonialism that still exist in such a wide variety of sectors. With respect to resources and land, I think my view of free, prior, and informed consent is that you try to get to yes, and you do that through dialogue, and you do that through dialogue from the get-go, and the consent has to be meaningful. Good projects will only go forward where they have that consent, and where that process has been respected, and where dialogue has been respected. I'm happy to say that a number of leaders in the resource industry, particularly after their interactions with National Chief Bellegarde and other leadership groups, I think are realizing that this is not only the best way forward, but it is the only way forward. And so I think there's a great deal of positive energy with respect to putting free, prior, and informed consent into practice as a process. And I think I'm optimistic. Judith, that will actually, at the end of the day, make the idea of a veto meaningless, in the sense that projects will only move forward where there is that level of collaboration between whoever is involved, and in particular the Indigenous peoples upon whose land the development is taking place. Chief Hardy, thank you again. We're doing our best to reach out to rights holders, and again, it is in the action plan, development of the action plan. You've got my commitment to doing that. All I ask, and I know that there's a question of timing or length of time, just make sure we have enough time that we can reach out to rights holders across Canada. I was at the Supreme Court as a law clerk to Justice Peter Corey when the Sparrow decision was being written by Chief Justice Brian Dixon at the time, and other judges. And so it's a particularly meaningful decision for me, and a meaningful moment in a very formative moment in my lifetime. So I thank you for underlining the importance of the Sparrow decision and its pivotal point in interpreting Section 35 as well as Section 91(24) of the Constitution. And I'm hopeful that the declaration, I said this in my remarks, but I'm hopeful that the declaration continues to build on that. But sometimes we're critical of the common law, but one of the nice things about the common law is it is open to new sources. And so I really do hope that the interplay will between the declaration and section 35 will actually make each of them better as we move forward, and as Indigenous peoples take a more meaningful role in participating in the evolution of the interpretation of these. They're not frozen, and I think both can be so much better. And I'm fundamentally optimistic. It's part of my nature, but I also understand that it will take a lot of hard work to get there. As regards the lands and processes that you're referring to, I'm not up on the files because they happen to be with Minister Bennett, who is the Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations, and those kinds of negotiations fall under CERNA. But again, I'm hopeful and optimistic that the kind of attitude that we're trying to promote through adopting C15, adopting the declaration, and then pushing forward with an action plan will have a positive impact in a variety of different places, including those kinds of land negotiations.
Thank you, Minister. Our next speaker would be Chief Delorme from Cowessess First Nation. So Chief Delorme, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the prayer rendered, and good afternoon to the Assembly, Minister Lemedi. Treaty 4 territory, Cowessess First Nation. I look at the end, the goal here to align as a nation to nation, that this is a positive step. I speak in favor, and I just share the following comments. I understand that this is to provide a legal requirement to work to align the current provisions that the government have to date. I think of the Constitution of 1982, and what came of that was Bill C31. I don't believe at that time that our women were put forefront by government to be as equal as best can be. I think it was a requirement because the Constitution told Canada that they have to do that. And I see that as a positive step with Bill C15, that we must align to make sure we are true equals in a nation to nation. So I speak of that as positive as I see C15 doing that. We do need a reinvestment and approach to land claims provisions. I do believe C15 will help with that. Reserve creation, the process of transitioning as a treaty land entitlement First Nation, I do see this as a positive. And also the fiduciary obligations on the outstanding funding formulas dating back to 1995 formula prior. I do see C15 as being that. My only caution, and I share this with Minister Lemedi, if you could bring this forward, is Cowessess First Nation, we are exercising 92 right now, Bill C92, the Act for Family, and the government has been responding accordingly, and we are testing a legislation that was used a year ago. There are a few challenges, but overall, I do give credit to the current government in your approach to implementing. It's not an easy task. My last comment is a concern is this strong enough? That is a concern, and I share that as the following. And there's three systems involved. There's the international legal order, there's the Canadian Constitution, and there's Indigenous legal systems. And right now, from my understanding, is that Cowessess, as a rights holder, we're not recognized as sovereign in international legal system, the same as the state of Canada is. And so, we do have more work ahead of us. I do see C15 as a step forward to being that real true nation to nation. And when it comes to Article 32 about the veto, we have projects that we sometimes are in favor or not in favor. The main thing is we got to be treated as equals. And when I see C15 holding all governments accountable. So thank you for allowing me to share a few words.
Great. Thank you, Chief Delorme. Our second speaker is going to be Regional Chief Hart from Manitoba. Regional Chief Hart. The floor is yours.
Everybody, thank you, Minister Lametti. One of the questions I have, obviously, in the development of C92, you see with First Nations, when you look at the UNDRIP legislation right now from an Indigenous lens, for us in Canada, it is, in comparison, how would you say, it differs for us as Indigenous people, and for us as First Nations people and rights holders who have a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government, and at the time the Crown that we signed the treaties with, is that when we talk about UNDRIP and that right now, you're seeing the dialogues from various respected regions where chiefs are in favor and also where chiefs are questioning the legislation. And of course, we have our chiefs that are against it. That being said, there is a number of concerns from rights holders that have signed treaties nation to nation. For example, in my region, we have various First Nations that have signed trilateral agreements in the past, including bilateral agreements with either the federal or the Crown, and then also there's provincial governments and of course other entities that are working and partnering with First Nations. To have the assurances, some of them asked for outside legal opinions as well to ensure that we have all the pros and cons issued to all our chiefs so that everyone's well informed on C15 and the overall aspect. That being said, you know, we want to lift up Grand Chief Little Child, as well as Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon and everyone else in the past that has worked on this legislation, and for the contributions for us as First Nations have given to the United Nations in various declarations. But I think what needs to be done is that the rightful rights holders need to be engaged properly and adequately. There needs to be a First Nation protocol that talks about that unique relationship when we talk nation to nation, including the treaty and inherent rights that First Nations have compared to the other Indigenous groups that are located here in Canada. You know, yes, there are brothers and sisters. However, as First Nations people, we have a clear, distinct nation-to-nation relationship and a treaty relationship that is recognized internationally. So that's the question that I have for you, Minister Lametti.
Thank you, Regional Chief Hart. Mr. Lametti, I'm seeing the time, so I believe these will be your final comments.
Okay. I want to thank Regional Chief Hart for that really easy question. Let me start there. Look, if you have suggestions, I agree. First of all, I too want to support and thank Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon for the work that she has done at a technical level on this. It's been fantastic, and all of the other members of the various technical teams and leadership groups that we've spoken to, as well as I want to thank my team as well. And for their work. But Regional Chief Hart, this is, we're trying to enshrine those very principles. Obviously, I am, as a matter of practice, trying to speak to as many rights holders as possible. But we're trying to enshrine, as a matter of practice, the very principles and values that you're referring to in your question. So recognizing the nation-to-nation nature and the fundamental nature, fundamental governance nature, fundamental symbolic nature of treaty rights and other treaty agreements with the Crown, and recognizing that moving forward, and bringing it to a better place, if you will, in terms of having weight in your relationship in a nation-to-nation basis with the government of Canada. And I think the declaration helps to do that, but I'm open to suggestions about how to do that better, either in the declaration, how to word it better, how to word those principles better, either in the declaration itself or in the action plan as we move forward. or in other pieces of legislation, as it were. So I look forward to seeing what the product of your deliberations will be, and particularly I know that you'll get legal advice, and you'll discuss amongst yourselves in your leadership group, you other chiefs, and you'll get back. And as I said, I commit to listening and to working in dialogue with you. And again, I agree with the principles. We agree on the principles. It's just a matter of finding language, and finding a way forward. Chief DeLorean from Cowessess First Nation, Treaty 4. Thank you, first of all, for those generous comments, and they're very much appreciated. This isn't always. Sometimes I get criticized, and that's part of the job, and it's fantastic. But it's nice to have a positive comment, I have to admit. So I thank you for that. Yes, there's complexity between Indigenous legal systems, and one of the things that I'm trying to do as minister, moving forward, and now the Prime Minister's tasked me with co-developing an Indigenous justice strategy with all of you. So that's coming too. Is to try to value and validate the Indigenous normative systems, the Indigenous legal systems that exist and can flourish and can expand, and or can be revived in cases where colonialism has suppressed them. And so you'll have some good news soon on some projects on Call to Action 50, hopefully soon. But there is complexity there. And so there are Indigenous normative systems. Then there are treaties. Then there are Canadian laws and international laws. And frankly, I just think, although there is complexity, we're just going to have to learn to navigate that complexity. And we all have an intuitive sense of what rules we have to follow at any given point. And I know that it's true. It's true that it will be a better place if we give more place to Indigenous normative systems, and we give more weight and respect to the normative structures and traditions that they involve. So I thank you for that question. I embrace that complexity. Sorry for the law professor kind of answer, but I fundamentally am passionate about this, and I believe in it. So you have ended this conversation with you in a very positive way. So I thank you for that. I thank you for that, Chief DeLorme.
Thank you, Minister Lametti. And I'd like to draw your attention to our Q&A section, where a few chiefs also left questions, which will be available for you and your staff, obviously, to look at and answer. I'd like to thank you for your time. I know you had a pretty hard stop, so thank you for your time with us. Thank you for taking the time to answer these questions. And I will now give the microphone off to my co-facilitator, Harold Tarville.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the minister, thank you to the participants. And yeah, so we will make sure that those comments that are in the chat, and I want to acknowledge Chief Bellegarde, or Ontario Regional Chief Archibald, Chief Leah George Wilson for adding those comments. Chief Sayers, also you had put your comment in there, so we'll ask AF and staff to make sure that gets over to the minister's office formally and through their channels, as well as the direct advocacy that you'll make following this. As noted in the guidelines, we'll keep the speakers list going, and so Chief Sayers, following the next section, we will come to you as the first speaker with your hand up. We do have what we would like to suggest by way of process, although it may stay on the agenda of break. We'd like to do this next panel, which is the video from Premier Horgan, and then to be joined by Minister Rankin for brief remarks and the Q&A. And then following that Q&A session, we would then look to take a break, and then that would prepare us for that final plenary, which would be, about a 90-minute plenary to really, get around the horn, as it were, in our discussions. So, and I do note that Minister Rankin is present here in the panel, and so I think we'll soldier on just a little bit longer here. And with that, the Premier Horgan has provided a video, and we will ask for that to be played. It's about 5.5 minutes. But I did want to acknowledge that And while he has appeared in a number of our meetings before, back in November, I think, of 2019, the Hawaii First Nation did, in fact, acknowledge the Premier for some of his work, particularly around really fixing up a deadly and dangerous logging road in their area. And they did give him the traditional name of Yaksumatashi, which is he who walks the path. And we just did want to acknowledge both the Hawiot Nation and the Premier for that. So with that, let's take a quick look at the video.
Hello, Premier John Horgan here. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. Thank you to National Chief Perry Bellegarde and Regional Chief Terry Teegee for the invitation to speak with you today. I'd also like to acknowledge and honor the elders, chiefs, and matriarchs and young leaders who are with us here today. I want to recognize Perry for his tireless advocacy on Indigenous issues over the last 6 years as National Chief. He has brought the concerns of Indigenous peoples to the forefront of Canadian public life. He's securing new protections for Indigenous children, working on Indigenous language legislation, and helping First Nations communities through the pandemic. I also want to send my strength and prayers to Grand Chief Stuart Phillip and his daughter Lori for a speedy recovery from their kidney transplant last week. The last time I saw many of you in person was at a special Chiefs Assembly in Ottawa in 2019. Only a few months later, we were challenged in ways we could not even imagine. The COVID-19 pandemic has slowed down some of the progress we were making, but has also brought into focus how important our government-to-government relationships are. By working in partnership, we can create opportunities for people and communities. We can establish a predictable and collaborative path forward for the businesses and industries that grow and sustain our communities. And we can build a better future for our children and their grandchildren. Here in BC, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act is guiding our work. On November 26, 2019, BC became the first province in Canada to pass legislation to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We worked collaboratively with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the Summit, and the BCAFN to develop that legislation. Yesterday, you heard from Regional Chief Terry Teegee, Cheryl Kashmir, and Cushby Judy Wilson on their experiences. It will always be one of the most important moments in my time as Premier, one of the proudest days seeing the legislation passed unanimously in our legislature. The Act recognizes and respects Indigenous rights as human rights. It sets out a process to align BC's laws with the UN Declaration, to make sure Indigenous peoples are included in the decisions that affect them, their families, and their territories. The Act commits our government and future governments to not just words, but actions on reconciliation. It will help us build strong environmental protections, create new opportunities for Indigenous peoples to be full partners in BC's economy, and move our province away from conflict and court battles and into a new era of rights recognition and cooperation. It took decades of hard work by Indigenous leaders from provincial, national, international levels to get us here. Leaders like Chief Wilton Littlechild and Romeo Saganash. Romeo, of course, introduced Bill C-262 back in 2016 to bring Canada's laws into harmony with the Declaration. The federal government is now delivering on its commitment to make that a reality. Our government welcomes Bill C-15. It fits well with our provincial priorities. Of course, we need to hear the voices of Indigenous peoples on Bill C-15, and it will take meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples for that process to be truly successful. In November, I appointed Murray Rankin as BC's new Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. Murray and I are looking forward to working with the federal government and Indigenous partners on their legislation within the context of BC. Many of you will know Murray well. He knows the Declaration inside and out. And here in BC, he is leading our government's work on implementing the Act. This work will include recognizing inherent rights and title. It will also see about building shared decision-making processes on issues like land use, resources, and child welfare. Establishing a secretariat to ensure new legislation and policies are consistent with the Act is a key part of Murray's work, creating clarity and predictability for everyone in our province. It's long overdue. We're proud to be leading by example here in BC. We recognize that leadership comes with great responsibility. Reconciliation is not easy, but it is necessary. Our government remains committed to this work. My hope is that the Bill C15 will pass and our work will inspire other provinces to do the same. It's about recognizing and respecting pre-existing inherent rights and treaty rights. Minister Rankin and I are already engaging with other provinces to make sure that they understand that what we've been doing in British Columbia is the right way forward, not just for us, but for them as well, to build a better future for everyone. For us and the generations that come after us, we need to make sure that we're focused on working together. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you again today. Haishka OCM from the territory of the Coast Salish people.
Thank you very much for that message being brought, and I'll turn it over to Minister Murray Rankin, the Minister for Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation with the Government of British Columbia.
Thanks very much, Harold. Let me begin by acknowledging, as the Premier did, that I'm speaking to you from the Lekwungen-speaking people's territory, today the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, right here in Victoria. I want to start by saying today is Moose Hide Day. Many of you know that. It's a national campaign, of course, to end violence against Indigenous women and girls, and I'm grateful that Paul Lacerte and Raven Lacerte have led us in that direction. I'm also grateful to be here to talk about the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People Act as reflected in British Columbia's laws. Last week I had a chance to speak at the UBC forum that dealt with this issue. I was on a panel with National Chief Bellegarde and a number of others, and I want to say thank you for that. I was with Minister Bennett and Minister Lametti, who was speaking just before us, and Chief Tom. I think we have a unique perspective to share with you today from British Columbia. First, let me acknowledge a few people. I'd like to acknowledge Knowledge Keeper Mike Mitchell for his opening prayer yesterday. And of course, some of the BC leadership here today, starting with Regional Chief Terry Teegee. Of course, we're all have Grand Chief Stuart Phillip in our prayers today for his speedy recovery from the surgery that he undertook so recently. I wish him well. I sent him a card and I'm just hoping for you, Chief. Cheryl Casimir, Robert Phillips, Lydia Whitsom of the Cowichan, who are of course with the First Nations Summit, Chief Don Tom, and Coopy Judy Wilson of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. All of these have worked tirelessly to advance the interests of First Nations, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that work. I'd also like to recognize, as Premier Horgan did, the Assembly of First Nations leadership, the elders, the matriarchs, and youth leaders who are joining today. There are a number of other esteemed Indigenous leaders from British Columbia. And I'd like to pay, if I may, particular tribute to Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond. I know she spoke yesterday and continues to be so deeply involved in the collaboration on Bill 41 in British Columbia and on C15 at the federal level. Dr. Turpel-Lafond recently undertook an in-depth review of racism directed against Indigenous peoples in BC's health system. I have to say that was a sobering report and a deeply disturbing report, and our government is committed to addressing each of the recommendations that were made and calling out racism wherever it occurs. Now, on the issue of our times, reconciliation, I need to reiterate something that Premier Horgan said. Reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is a top priority for our government. Despite a global pandemic that's turned all of our worlds upside down, we remain committed to this generation-changing work. We're finding new and collaborative ways to continue working together, to continue to build meaningful and lasting relationships. I don't need to tell anyone here how difficult that can be sometimes, but it's critical to our success as a province, to our success as a country. Now, the Declaration Act itself. I'm proud that British Columbia was the first jurisdiction in Canada to implement the UN Declaration through legislation, not aspirational legislation, but meaningful legislation that is required to change government behavior. And I think it also is crucial to note, that the Premier did as well, that this was not just an initiative that the current government passed without support, but it passed unanimously over a year ago with every single member of our legislative body standing up and voting for this initiative. But it needs to be said that the leadership of Indigenous partners on this was central to that success. And we're very, very proud to have been able to work directly with our Indigenous partners on the Declaration Act and implementing that bill as we're currently doing. I can honestly say, I know politicians are sometimes prone to exaggeration, but this was an unprecedented degree of collaboration. The Declaration Act provides us with a path forward in British Columbia. It's a path that's going to respect Indigenous peoples' human rights, first and foremost. And it also will create clarity and predictability for us all. Bill C15 is similar to British Columbia's legislation, although there are some differences I'll come to. Number one, it mandates us to bring provincial laws into line with the UN Declaration. It requires us, it's not a nice to have, it's a must have, to develop an action plan in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. Those words are really important, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. It requires us to report annually on our progress. Now, there are two other elements in the BC law that I think need to be stressed that I don't think are found to the same degree, if at all, in the federal bill. The first is flexibility to enter into agreements with Indigenous governing bodies, and a framework for shared decision-making agreements between government and those Indigenous governing bodies on matters that impact their citizens. I think our legislation in British Columbia was well received for a couple of important reasons. Firstly, what I talked of earlier, that deep collaboration with Indigenous peoples in its development. And secondly, the deep engagement that the Indigenous peoples undertook with us with stakeholders and community leaders both before and after the introduction. Business leaders, community, municipal leaders, and so forth were involved in this and supportive of this initiative. So the key, I think, was transparency and engagement. That is why I think we succeeded in Bill 41. And I hope that's a lesson for those trying to implement Bill C15. It was an historic milestone, but it was only the start. As I'm reminded constantly, we're just into the real work now of implementing that. I call it putting meat on the bones. And in doing so, we're working in partnership with all BC Indigenous peoples to develop that action plan. As a minister, this is my top priority, to get that right, to get that action plan, the first meaningful one, the first one that'll have a number of initiatives identified to go forward. Now, inevitably, some are going to say we're not going fast enough in that work, and others are saying we're going too fast. But the bottom line is real, meaningful collaboration takes time. And in particularly in the world of Zoom and the like, it's difficult. Our act requires us to develop this action plan, and I quote, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking the time to get it right, to meet our strong commitment to develop an action plan in cooperation and consultation. Let's talk about Bill C15. I think British Columbia is pleased that Canada is following suit to introduce legislation to implement the UN Declaration. And we're very supportive of any work to uphold the standards of the UN Declaration anywhere else in Canada. I've had the opportunity to review the federal bill. I've spoken with federal ministers about it as it's currently written. And I honestly think it aligns well with our provincial priorities. And what, of course, is most critical, though, is to hear what our Indigenous partners think of this initiative. Many of you here today, as inherent rights holders, treaty rights holders, are going to have important insights and views to share as the bill goes through the legislative process. Now, we in British Columbia see opportunities to collaborate. And if the federal legislation comes into law, which we hope it does, I think it'll help align us, the British Columbia and the federal initiatives together, aligning with other legislation that needs to be brought into compliance with the UN Declaration going forward. And so I think that both British Columbia and the federal bills are going to strengthen our province and strengthen our country as a whole. I want to say right now that my government is willing to help in any way we can to assist in the implementation of Bill C15, and as National Chief Bellegarde has talked about, the ability to create more self-determination for Indigenous peoples in our country. I'm willing to do whatever we can to explain to others our experience and lessons learned, and I extend my hand to Indigenous leaders in British Columbia who might work together to help dispel fears that might exist at the federal level. Every BC cabinet minister has in his or her mandate letter a requirement to address reconciliation head on and to implement the United Nations Declaration. I believe we've made important progress in many areas in our first term as government. In BC, in British Columbia, the Declaration Act is the foundation of our work going forward. I'm not going to pretend we don't have a lot to do to reverse over 150 years of colonialism and systemic racism. That's going to take work. It's going to take time. We're going to have to do it together. It may be a generation, but we can take concrete steps now on this journey, a journey that must include all Indigenous peoples in this province. We've got a lot of work ahead of us to do together, to breathe life into those articles, those 46 articles and preambles, if you will, in the Declaration. Those have got to square with the laws of our province, not just laws going forward, but laws in the past that are on the books right now. How are we going to do that? That's my preoccupation. But we're doing it in a government-to-government way in true partnership and cooperation. Because our legislation doesn't just give us an opportunity to work together, it gives us a requirement to work together for the benefit of all of us. Now, I know there are those who fear C15. The words free, prior, and informed consent have been raised in the past as concerns. But what I want to say to that is this. From our experience in British Columbia, we can move to consent-based decision-making. That's possible under our statute. And that will make a difference in terms of equitable decision-making and certainty on the ground for generations to come. To me, it's always about relationships. Respectful, collaborative partnerships. That's what we're going to need to foster the predictability that everyone wants, so we can have good jobs, so our children can advance. So there's opportunities for everyone, but at the same time, we uphold the civil and human rights of Indigenous peoples. I don't think that's scary. I think it's time. You know, Cheryl Casimir famously said in the BC legislature when Bill C41 was introduced, "Do you hear it? The sky didn't fall." And I think she captured that brilliantly. So by way of conclusion, I want to recognize the leadership of Indigenous peoples, not just recently, but over decades in developing the UN Declaration, and champion and championing its adoption and implementation into our laws. People like Chief Wilton Littlechild and my friend Romeo Saganash, who I had the pleasure of sitting with in Parliament when he introduced his historic Bill C-262. Romeo was an enormously powerful leader in that regard and tireless in his efforts. But there were countless others who fought for the human rights of Indigenous peoples to be recognized over our lifetime. I believe it's because of this leadership that we've been able to make the incremental process we have here in British Columbia to unanimously pass and now implement the UN Declaration. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission called on all levels of government to adopt the UN Declaration as the framework for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I'm very proud that that is what we've done in British Columbia together through the Declaration Act. Now, that's what we hope other provincial governments will do, and I stand ready to assist in any way to explain the positive experience we've had in British Columbia, if that would be of assistance to other provinces. And that is the potential that I think Bill C-15 has federally as it stands before us. I reiterate, to be successful, it has to be done with Indigenous peoples. I'm looking forward to your questions and our discussion that's to come now, and I want to thank you. And now, Harold, I'll pass it back to you to start things off with our question and answer session. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Rankin. I did want to note that in terms of our speakers list, I do invite the attendees to use the raised hands function, or as also you can add some questions to the Q&A function that are available for this. I would note that prior to your presentations, Chief Dean Sayers had raised his hand and had asked a question, was in the chat or in the Q&A around, you know, the importance of honoring the original pre-existing unextinguished rights in Canadian law, which were inherited from the Crown. And I do want to check with Chief Sayers if he just wants to bring that into the conversation. And I would note that it also reflects a similar question we see in the Q&A from Chief Ignace, who we'll bring into the conversation a bit later around the relationship between Bill C-15 and pre-existing rights. And then I would also note that Chief Leah George Wilson had raised her hand earlier around an issue around that circumstance where First Nations, in fact, do express a no, and how that working relationship would work. And so I want to look to those two chiefs to see if they would wish to take the floor. And you could indicate that by re-raising your hand in the, yes, let's bring Chief Sayers forward, and then I'll look to see if Chief Leah George Wilson as well. And Minister Rankin will take two questions, and then we'll turn to you for a response. Chief Sayers, if you are here, ask our technicians to, there he's on his way. There you are, Chief Sayers. If you'll unmute your mic, and if you're able to turn on your camera, that would be great. Welcome, sir.
Miigwech Harold, Miigwech Kiniwea, Ugamanamanagoshing Guyakusid, Chief Dean Sayers from the center of North America here, center of the Great Lakes, near Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, in Batchewana First Nation. We've got a really beautiful relationship with the Crown that was struck prior to Canada, not even in existence. And my elders have insisted that I never forget the original relationships. And we do recognize that UNDRIP is something that is a reference for us, but we recognize here that there's no power there, and that it may be something that's like the expectations that we as Indigenous people expect. However, we find more value, and the expectation in our relationship is that Canada, the new Canada that's been here for a short while, honor the inherited obligations that they have to us in our legally binding relationship that touches on many, many issues. And I just wanted to make mention, and I will get to the point here, but one of the things that we're conscious of is that in our canoe, we still have and maintain so many jurisdictions, our citizenship, our law, our justice systems, our lands, our language, the moose, the fish, everything is still in our canoe. And we recognize that Canada has some things in their ship. And I watch Canada's ship and how they act over there, and it's really befuddling. It's really concerning, but that's their business, how they govern themselves. But I would say, as how Canada governs themselves, that I would hope that it's more reflective of what they've inherited. And I would wish that they would truly embrace the obligations set out with a number of agreements from coast to coast to coast. There can't be one foul swoop that can be taken that may be captured within UNDRIP. And if it doesn't go the way Canada wants, I'm really concerned about Clause 46 and the veto that I see in UNDRIP as it stands in itself, and that's concerning to me. In our relationship with the Crown that was struck through many treaties, there was never, at the end of those treaties, and the Crown will have a veto over both parties. So as per another chief's comment, I was just wondering what the answer would be in BC if a large group, or if First Nations who have reserved jurisdiction and sovereignty and rights say that they say no. Is that's free prior informed consent, as Chief Judy was saying earlier. What's to interpret around consent? Consent means yes or no. It doesn't mean that it's maybe, or let's talk about it some more. But I just wanted to get some interpretation. And as it stands in my neck of the woods where I come from, in this pre-Confederation territory, I can't support. I look forward to a true embracing of the inheritance that Canada, as the administrator of our treaty, has to honor the spirit and intent of our original relationship that was struck with the Crown, which is now under the watchful eye of the Governor General in Canada, who has that obligation and responsibility. And that's how I envision it, but I'm looking forward to hearing your interpretation. And even if the Premier was available, that would be appreciated as well. But I'm just wondering how this rolls out on the land if there are things that are acting contrary to the original relationship. So, miigwech, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Chief Chairs. And just before we go to Minister Rankin, I would note that I did check for Chief Leah George Wilson. She doesn't appear to still be in the meeting, but Chief Sayers, in fact, did bring in her question around the issue of what happens when a no gets expressed. So over to you, Minister Rankin, and then we'll look to just verify if Cookby Ignace wishes to ask his question.
Thanks very much. And to Chief Sayers, I'm glad you started by saying you were in the center of the country and not the center of the universe, the way that people in Toronto always refer to it. That was funny. And I know very well, Chief Sayers, your territory. I grew up for a lot of my life up in Thunder Bay and spent a lot of time near Sault Ste. Marie. And I know about the Robinson Superior Treaties and the Robinson Huron Treaties. In fact, my late partner, Joe Arve, was counsel for the Robinson Superior Treaty group until his untimely death a few months ago. So thank you for reminding us of the center of the country that you speak from. You talked about Indigenous laws, and I think the first thing to note is that we accept in British Columbia that there is, of course, the inherent right, and there are existing and to be created Indigenous laws. And I'm very proud that the University of Victoria, where I used to work, has Professor John Borrows and Professor Val Napoleon, who recently started Canada, in fact, the world's first Indigenous law program, where common law and Indigenous law is learned as separate law systems to enrich our understanding of both. And I think that's really important. Now, to the specific question, there is in the C15 and there is in our bill a so-called non-derogation clause, which means that nothing we're doing is to take away from the constitutional rights that Indigenous people have for Aboriginal rights and treaty rights as guaranteed in Section 35. So people were concerned, I know Indigenous groups from British Columbia may speak to this, that we not somehow water down the work that the courts are doing to pour a meaning into that Section 35. The derogation clause is taken very, very seriously. I also would say that the United Nations Declaration, to Chief Sayers, is an interpretive device that our courts can use to decide, as we go forward with Section 35 jurisprudence, how to that Canada has accepted this. It's a declaration of rights. Canada has embraced that, and our province as well has embraced that, and that will therefore allow, as an interpretive vehicle, more meaning to be put in to make sure that your treaty rights are upheld. Lastly, on the question about consent, the famous free, prior, and informed consent. Our bill talks about an action plan to deal with things in the future. If there is, and I like the expression you used, the idea of obligations that were inherited obligations of the Crown. I love that expression. If those obligations are not being taken seriously, then number one, there's that interpretive piece I talked about. Number two, you still have Section 35. And number three, the action plan could give priority to getting those, if you will, inherited obligations to be confirmed. And I think the action plan could speak specifically to that. So I think it all in all can be a very positive outcome. Last thing I'll say is we are in British Columbia looking for examples of what we call shared decision-making under Section 7 of our Act. Acknowledge that's not in the federal bill, but where we will have shared decision-making and in some cases consent-based decision-making of the kind that Chief Sayers alluded to. So I think we've got lots to do, but those are some, I hope, early responses to Chief Sayers.
Thank you very much, Minister Rankin. I just wanted to maybe note a couple of procedural things. So for the attendees, you do see at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat button and a Q&A button. Chat's not been enabled in the settings here, and so we are using the Q&A function for that. So please do that. I do want to refer the Minister to the Q&A if you're able to see that on your computer. There are a couple of questions there from Chief Cook-Ignace and from Regional Chief Picard. And I do want to thank Marilyn Chappell as well. She's been responding to a number of those questions as we go through the morning. So I do appreciate that. Let me just check with Cook-Ignace. If you wish to address your question on pre-existing rights, please raise your hand. And same with Regional Chief Picard. If you wish to address your question, please raise your hand and we will bring you into the panel. Please bring Cook-Ignace into the panel, please. And then I'll look to see if Regional Chief Picard doesn't raise his hand, then we'll look to his question in the Q&A. So we are bringing Cook-Ignace into the panel, and then following him, we'll bring Regional Chief Picard into the panel. Welcome, Cook-Ignace. Let's ask you to unmute your microphone, and if you're able to unmute or to turn on the camera. And there you go. Welcome.
Wait. لا أنا اللي غلطت تسخايس قلمينتم تقلبينستم تمسخاسيم ي وتنويسكوك سليلك سلتيم خمن سوخنسكوك سمسمان أليس وأكسكوك تميخس. Thank you for having me on here, and an honor to be able to ask a simple question. But my question is this and I would like to congratulate the new minister and his position in the province. Murray, I thought Minister Murray Rankin. I was wondering if you were related to Harry Rankin.
That's a question. Is it okay if I answer?
Yeah, and then I'll ask my question. But yeah.
When I moved to British Columbia and I worked in Vancouver as a young lawyer, I got asked the question that Ignace asked me every single day. Harry Rankin, as some of you from different parts of the country may know, was a very feisty communist in the past, hardworking counselor, highly respected as a lawyer, did a lot of work with Indigenous people, but he also was on city council. So when I was asked that question, am I related to Harry Rankin? I would say it depends who's because either he was a friend of the working people, etc., or he was a commie. And so I had to carefully walk along that path. But I knew Harry well and admired him deeply.
My question is this: is the recognition of Indigenous rights expressly stated in the legislation that it is recognized as pre-existing rights?
Thank you very much.
I would say the answer.
Minister, if we could, I appreciate that. But let's bring in the Regional Chief Picard's question as well. And then following that, I do have two other raised hands, and then we'll see where we are relative to our time. Regional Chief Picard just making his way to the microphone, as it were. And thank you. I see that you've unmuted your mic, Regional Chief. If you're able to turn on your camera, that would be great. It's not required, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Harold. I can't find the option for the camera. I'm sorry. But I just want to thank Minister Rankin and for his comments, and of course, Premier Horgan as well. And definitely, I think our BC sisters and brothers will be in a better position to judge the actions of their own government. But obviously, coming from Quebec, we tend to compare notes with between what happens in Quebec and what happens in BC because of the similarities in terms of the geopolitical situation. And Minister Rankin raised the possibility of bringing some assistance or help when required, and not in a way to challenge him, but I know that BC, as the other provinces, are part of the Council of Federation, and we have a government in Quebec that is light years away from the positions taken by the BC government when it comes to UNDRIP and its application. And I just wondered, how far the British Columbia government is willing to go to force that issue within that spectrum of the Council of Federation. I think it's very important to foresee the problems, even if federal legislation were to be adopted. Thank you.
Over to you, Minister.
Thank you, Harold. Well,
looks like we lost the minister there through a technical issue. So we'll let them get resituated to bring him back online. And I would note that Chief Leader George Wilson has rejoined us. And Chief Wilson, I did want to note that in his question commentary, Chief Dean Sayers, in fact, did include your question about what happens if we get to a no. Welcome back, Minister Rankin. As noted, there are two questions in front of you, one from Cookby Ignace regarding pre-existing rights, and then from Regional Chief Picard regarding working with Quebec and the Council of Federation. You'll unmute your mic. Nope, still muted. You still seem to be muted, Mr. Minister.
There you go.
There you are.
Now? I'm really
Yes.
sorry. It said I had an unstable connection. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
I assume it's a bad thing. First of all, to Cookpew Ignace, an excellent question. Are existing rights recognized? I would argue yes, because of what I said about Section 35. The existing Indigenous and Aboriginal and treaty rights are confirmed, and this document we passed unanimously does not derogate from that. So I think that's a very important thing that I know the Indigenous peoples with whom we worked in BC were insistent on that section being in there, and perhaps Dr. Trapel-Lafond would have indicated that in her remarks. To Regional Chief Picard in Quebec, I really want to say that I've spent a lot of time in your province. The Council of Federation may well be a vehicle, but I think it's really important that we stay within our lanes in terms of the federal government and provincial government. We don't like the federal government telling a province what to do, and I'm sure the Quebec government would not look at us telling them what to do in any way. What we can do is offer our hand and say, perhaps in partnership with British Columbia Indigenous groups and Leadership Council, if they would like to join us, we will explain our situation. Our situation where I've had the Chamber of Commerce and the BC Business Council and municipalities, and of course the Indigenous leadership saying we did something pretty special here. And as Ms. Casimir said, you know, the sky didn't fall. And I think that message would be helpful, not in a we told you way, but in a hopefully a supportive way to those provinces who might be reluctant and wonder, gee, I wonder if we should go along this journey together. I think we have a lot to offer. I think we're proud of what we've done. I'm not here to say it's all done, it's just started. But we can assist and we stand ready to assist. If the people of Quebec would like us to come, I would be delighted to do so.
Thank you very much for that. So let's, we've got three hands up. They're all BC, so I just want to be conscientious of the fact, and of course it is a BC minister and the Premier who spoke, so I'm conscientious of that as well. But we are looking to, I think given the time frame, we'll take these three questions that are here and then we'll look to the break. I've got Chief Councillor Ken Watts, followed by Judith Sayre, the President of New Toronto Tribal Council. So bringing Ken is just making his way here. Chief Watts is just making his way here. I don't see him arriving, so I'm just going to check with our techs on that. And then the other one that we will bring forward would be Judith Sayre from the New Toronto Tribal Council. I do see Judith has arrived. Welcome, Judith.
Hello, and thank you. Good to see you, Minister, in person over the computer. I just wanted to say that I really wished I lived in the BC you described. It sounded like utopia. One day we'll have a conversation about things that happened, but that is not relevant here today. I think Bill C15 and DRIPA is a chance to change the history and of things that have happened in the past and how do we make them better. We've talked about free, prior, and informed consent, and the history, of course, in British Columbia is the big projects, TMX, Site C, LNG, what happened with the Wet'suwet'en when they were removed from their land in a violent way by the RCMP. Would that have happened had we fully implemented DRIPA? And how do we avoid that in the future? And of course, I think one of those tools is the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people and figuring out what that means. I think the Nuu-chah-nulth, one of the frustrations is the slow pace of implementing DRIPA. We'd love to see as a priority some of the Clean Energy Act being aligned with UNDRIP. You know, in particular, let's put aside the self-sufficiency, getting rid of self-sufficiency. The Heritage Conservation Act, we've been trying to amend that for several years. And one of the tools in the BC DRIPA is to do joint decision-making or consent before decision-making. And this isn't in the federal bill. So this is something that, you know, we could look at is this a good tool for the federal act? But, you know, we're being told at our tables that number one, there's no mandate to do any of these joint decision-making or consent before decision-making of statutory powers. And the minister's decision to be fettered has to be addressed through other legislation. And my question is, how do we do that? Or how are you planning on doing that? And how soon? Because we met with chiefs across the BC a couple days on heritage conservation, and we've been trying to get a Section 4 agreement in place for over 5 years, and we've been looking to Section 7 as another one. So, that's my question, is that, we have these bills, and I know C15 talks about 3 years for implementation. And BC, we've been waiting. And so how quickly can we get into implementation of the laws, the priority laws, and into negotiating shared decision-making, not just on heritage conservation and saving our sacred sites, but in all other matters that are important to us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith Sayers. Let's go to Lise Behan, Chief for Coldwater, as our last question here. Then we'll turn to the Minister for some responses and any final remarks that he has before we go to our next stage. Chief Behan, welcome to the panel, and I'll ask you to unmute your mic, Chief Behan, and if you're able to, turn on your camera. And there you go. Welcome, sir.
Hello and good morning. Lise Behan, Chief of the Coldwater Band, speaking from the unceded territory of Insuletku of the Nakatlum Nation. Thanks for your presentation, Minister Rankin. I was taking down some notes and listening to what you had to say, and very interesting. When I sit down and meet with provincial or federal representatives, ministers, one thing is looking for commitment, and looking for the commitment from provincial ministers and federal ministers on how does the province of British Columbia, such as yourself, Minister Rankin, plan to work with provincial ministers or federal ministers. And I say that because, there's lots of concerns and issues that Coldwater has. It's been a very, very busy month during COVID, and keeping up with all the meetings that are online. One of the major files we're working on is water, but also that's been brought up and that's been discussed within the First Nations here in British Columbia is the salmon. And those are very big issues. In the past 3 years here in Coldwater, we haven't seen any salmon. And, the jurisdiction has a big part of it because different salmon stocks are provincially regulated and different are federally regulated. So with the First Nations, and I'd like to say Coldwater, but also with our nation, the Nakatlum Nation, when does the province and the federal government plan to sit down with us and talk about it? Because, there's a lot of talk around reconciliation, racism. We've heard racism come up at our fisheries meetings, both from provincial and DFO reps. Consultation and cooperation. Very good points. But you hear from a lot of chiefs when they talk about trust and respect. That needs to be earned. And I think having discussions like this and making sure we can all move in a positive way will start making things a little bit better for the future. So some comments and questions that I have. Kokstam, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. Minister. So again, responding to the two questions and then final comments.
Well, thank you very much, Harold. And perhaps I can start with Chief Councillor Spahan's question. I first of all want to confirm trust and respect have to be earned is entirely my experience and entirely what I hope I can achieve, that trust and respect. I take this job very, very seriously, and it's a huge honor and to have it. And you speak, Chief Councillor Spahan, about commitment. I think we are committed. I think when you have every single minister in his or her mandate letter, like their report cards, if you will, to take reconciliation to heart and to put UNDRIP at the center, I think you have a commitment that we have made to the people of British Columbia, and we'll be held accountable if we've done it adequately or not. People will let us know. I certainly take that seriously, and I can assure you that all of our colleagues do too. On the specific issue of salmon, I had an awfully good meeting just the other day with the Coastal First Nations, led by Chief Marilyn Slett of the Healtsik, and we talked a lot about one of the agreements that's soon to be implemented in their territory that is all about salmon. And you know, the federal government and the provincial government each have responsibility, as the chief mentioned very accurately. You know, salmon comes from the land. It doesn't come from the ocean. And we have, therefore, with our habitat protection regime, so much that we can do. And we've got my colleague Finn Donnelly, who's famous for his efforts on salmon protection, responsible in part for that, along with a number of other colleagues, so that the provincial government does it right. I do think we're working better with our federal partners now than perhaps ever before on fishing. So I just hope that the Chief, you'll know that we are committed to that together with our federal colleagues. To Dr. Sayers, the Chalmette Tribal Council Chief, Judith Sayers, made a number of important points. The first I'd start with is I never would suggest, and I hope my remarks confirm, that I am not suggesting that this is utopia in British Columbia by any means. I alluded to 175 years of colonial history that we've inherited. And I'm not suggesting that we turn a switch and everything gets better. And I don't expect that. Indigenous leaders don't expect that either, from my experience. We've got a lot of work to do, and we do have challenges. But as Dr. Sayers definitely, I think, accurately pointed out, we do have the ability to go into shared decision-making and indeed consent-based decision-making under Section 7. And there are places where we're working right now in British Columbia to implement not only shared decision-making, but consent-based decision-making. And I'm hoping announcement can be made shortly on that, in that regard, because nothing would make me happier than to have some great success stories for Section 7. In terms of the pace of getting the action plan done, we're working hard at a technical level. Many people on this call will be part of that process. We want to get it right. COVID has got in the way. I found Zoom not a terribly effective way to negotiate and work together, but we're all doing our best in these pandemic times to get it right. But we are making progress, and I hope that the action plan that's soon to be emerged, and the next little while a consultation draft will be emerging for people's comments and deeper engagement. I'm confident we're going to make great progress on that, and that people will be pleased with our success. You mentioned, Dr. Sayers, the Heritage Conservation Act. That's an example of one of the existing laws that we definitely need to prioritize to address early on. Family and child welfare has been, legislation has been one that I've been told over and over again needs to be carefully addressed. We have work we're doing on the Police Act that needs to be carefully addressed. Existing laws on the books, if you will. And yes, the Heritage Conservation Act is very much on that list. And so that's sort of the work that the new secretariat that I'm charged with figuring out how to implement within our system will address. So it's not just future laws, but it's existing laws. And you put your finger on one of the most important ones that we need to address that's currently on the books, namely the Heritage Conservation Act. Your questions raised a number of other issues, but I hope that does some justice to the very important points that you've made. Thank you, Harold.
Perfect. Thank you, Minister Mary Rankin, for those words, for your time that you spent with us. And I'd like to thank also Premier Horgan, obviously, for his video, and your staff for helping us. We have had BC with us, the chiefs of BC with us yesterday to explain the process. So it's good to get both sides of the discussion. So thank you very much, Minister Murray Rankin. And for our attendees, thank you. For our attendees, this is now a moment where we're going to shift gears, and we're done with the presentations for the day. We're going to give you a 15-minute break, coming back at 3:15 Eastern, and then we're going to start getting into an open discussion between leadership across Turtle Island to see what we've thought about the past few days, where we want to go with these discussions, and maybe the next steps. So 15-minute break, and then I'll see you in a few. Thank you, everyone.
Bonjour, oui. Alors, nous allons recommencer. Nous avons tous eu l'occasion d'avoir une pause, de prendre un peu de recul et de réfléchir à ce qu'on a entendu et peut-être aussi penser à ce qui s'en vient. Et justement, on arrive à notre dernière séance plénière, à la dernière portion du dialogue possible entre les nations, entre les dirigeants des Premières Nations. Mais juste avant, je voulais simplement vous donner une petite note d'information pour vous dire que le site, le micro-site de l'APN qui est dédié au forum sur C15 contient beaucoup d'informations, de documentation, de références qui peut être très utile pour accompagner votre café ou accompagner vos réflexions et vos lectures. Alors, je vous laisse ça ici. Vous pourrez consulter le tout lorsque cela sera possible. C'est quand vous descendez la page sur le site, c'est le site sur Bill C15. Vous pourrez voir ces documents-là et puis ce sont les documents qui sont les plus à jour sur le site de l'APN. Alors, maintenant, on a quand même une très bonne période devant nous. On a l'occasion de pouvoir vous entendre, vous exprimer. C'est vraiment le moment en ce moment. Et comme depuis le début, je vous rappelle qu'il y a deux façons de vous adresser à l'Assemblée ou au forum, pardon. C'est évidemment pas une assemblée, donc au forum de discussion, de dialogue. La première façon, c'est en levant la main avec la fonction de Zoom et on va pouvoir suivre l'ordre des questions selon l'ordre de lever les mains. Et sinon, en rédigeant une question, un commentaire, une réaction, en utilisant la fonction questions et réponses, Q&A. Et je vous rappelle que beaucoup de gens nous écoutent en ce moment, que ce soit au niveau du leadership des Premières Nations, mais aussi au niveau des observateurs qui sont inscrits sur ce forum. Alors, c'est l'occasion de partager vos préoccupations, vos commentaires, vos questions. Et aussi, bien, on vous encourage aussi à proposer des solutions, des modifications aussi, si vous en avez des idées de modification au projet de loi C15. Alors, c'est aussi l'occasion, je prends le temps de le répéter, je sais que je l'ai dit à quelques reprises, mais je veux simplement vous dire que c'est l'occasion d'entendre un large éventail de points de vue. Et pour le moment, nous n'avons pas beaucoup entendu, je suis contente, on a entendu quand même une diversité des genres, mais on n'a pas beaucoup entendu de diversité au niveau des régions, je pense aux provinces de l'Est, par exemple, ou au Nord, et à l'Alberta aussi. Et donc, c'est le moment. La parole est à vous. J'attends de voir des mains levées et de pouvoir vous accueillir sur le podium. Parce que là, pour l'instant, je suis seule et j'aimerais bien que quelqu'un puisse venir s'adresser et prendre le micro. Alors, je regarde la liste et pour le moment, il n'y a personne. Comme je dis aussi, la fonction questions et réponses, c'est aussi disponible en ce moment. Et si une question ne peut pas être répondue immédiatement, inquiétez-vous pas, sachez qu'on s'occupe de garder un suivi sur les questions et Ils seront adressés ou elles seront adressées lorsque possible, mais sinon, on tente dans la mesure du possible de vous répondre de façon instantanée. Pratiquement. Alors, beaucoup de bonnes, tous des interventions au cours de la journée, beaucoup de réflexions. Je ne sais pas si les provinces de l'Est, je regardais le Yukon, le territoire du Nord-Ouest, Nouveau-Brunswick, Nouvelle-Écosse, île du Prince-Édouard, Terre-Neuve-Labrador, par exemple, qu'on n'a pas beaucoup ou pas entendu, Alberta. Alors, je vous invite à le faire. Et puis, je suis en train de... Quand je regarde à ma droite ou à votre gauche, je ne sais pas de quelle façon vous me voyez, mais c'est parce que je regarde la liste qui se génère, mais qui ne se génère pas en ce moment. Alors, je vais attendre un petit peu. J'aimerais vraiment avoir la possibilité d'apporter quelqu'un sur le podium, virtuellement, évidemment. Qu'est-ce que vous avez pensé des discussions, du dialogue? Où on est parti? Où est-ce qu'on veut aller? Où on en est aujourd'hui? Est-ce qu'on a changé notre point de vue? Est-ce qu'on a apporté des compléments à nos réflexions? Toutes les idées, les points de vue sont bons et sont importants. Est-ce que des chefs régionaux, RCs, est-ce que des chefs régionaux souhaitent s'exprimer? Vous avez la parole aussi. Vous avez la liberté de le faire en ce moment. C'est vraiment la dernière portion de la journée pour s'exprimer et possiblement répondre à d'autres qui ont apporté ou complémenté ou apporter une conclusion ou compléter ce que quelqu'un d'autre auparavant a dit ou revenir sur un point important. C'est l'occasion, c'est maintenant. So this is the... Pardon, je m'entends. Je vais changer en anglais parce que peut-être qu'il y a un problème avec la traduction, je ne sais pas. Mais juste avant, je vois que j'aimerais qu'on amène au micro Judith Sayers au microphone de l'Assemblée.
Hello.
Oui, bonjour, hello. The floor is yours.
I'll get you out of your misery. I mean, I already spoke about today and Mr. Lametti, but you know, I really dislike having to respond to things as opposed to having been every First Nation across the country being consulted on what should be in this act. And I think there'd be a lot more people who are positive towards that. So now we have Bill C15 that we have to respond to. My biggest concern about Bill C15, and you heard my frustration when I talked to the minister, was our ability to get the government to implement their law. We see lots of good things that happen at times. You know, we win court cases and it never gets implemented. And, you know, that's a big source of frustration for us. You know, for instance, they house a case where they won the right to a commercial fishery, or actually recognized the right to a commercial fishery. And 12 years later, we still haven't got it implemented. And so I don't want the same frustration of Bill C15. So how do we give it teeth? You know, and I've talked about this before, that it would be really great to create an independent body that has power over both the federal government and First Nations, so that, you know, if we hit a wall, we can go to this body and they can help us get through that. And, you know, I think some of the hitting the wall is going to be about terms such as free, prior, informed consent. restitution, reparation, compensation, self-determination, because obviously, you know, we have different things. And as much as you hear the ministers talking about how wonderful it all could be, it's going to be tough. And, you know, how do we, or what can we put in place in the way of an independent tribunal that would have power to make us implement the UNDRIP? And I think about this quite a bit and wonder, you know, how can we make it better? How can we allow each First Nation to be doing their own self-determination, doing the smaller things, that we don't have to wait for the federal government or an action plan, that we can in our own communities do what we need to do now, based talking about Minister Lametti talking about this morning, I forgot to mention it to him, is that we don't have to wait for an action plan. We don't have to wait for C15, and if it never gets passed, I mean, that's a good thing. So how can we start doing shared decision-making agreements now? How can we have the right to development and determining what developments happen in our territory? Because that's a huge thing. You know, we've been overlooked. So, you know, that's one of my big things, is how do we make the federal government implement this? My second big issue is just in relation to having a clause in relation to, if this bill ever gets amended or repealed, that we have the right of consent before that happens. And I really wish that we had had that right as we begin Bill C15. So basically, you know, what is our backup plan with respect to that? And I also think that, you know, internally, we need to figure out how we can align the laws of Canada with our rights, because each of us across the country will have different laws that we want to amend, such as the Fisheries Act, or the Environmental Assessment Act, or the Oceans Act. And how can we do this? Are we doing it individually? Should we call together collective groups that have the same interests so we can work together? And I really think that we have to, because now they're amending the Police Act, and I've heard Minister Miller talk about a Health Act, an Indigenous Health Act. How do we, you know, we need to set a process, and this is, tell the government this is how they have to work with us to implement new legislation, because I always feel like we're being frustrated in not having everybody involved from the very beginning. And so I, you know, internally within ourselves across the country, are we going to allow the, you know, are we going, and we can advance that together, or are we all going to do it individually? So I think there's also work that needs to be done on just, you know, our own, and I don't think we've ever developed that at AFN, is what is our action plan with respect to the different sections of the declaration, and how are, you know, or if we do this provincially, I don't care how we do it, or we do it all individually, but, you know, we just need to have that plan so we can be more effective. So just a few comments to start the day. You know, if we're not going to get this through C15, or if the Senate stops it, you know, what is our backup plan? You know, I think about that as well. You know, we should be able to be determining our own self-determination, our own shared decision-making models, without having to have legislation anyway. These are inherent rights. So I think that we need to pursue our own political agenda as well, despite C15. So thank you.
Thank you, President Sayers. So this is the final dialogue session for First Nation leaders. I will now call on Chief King, and then we'll hear Chief Polchis, and after that, Chief Sanderson. I now invite Chief King to the microphone floor.
Thank you.
Thank you. To you.
Thank you very much. First of all, Chief Wilfred King, Kiasaging Anishinaabe, Gulbe First Nation. I think that there's about 6 points I want to make, and I will elaborate on just a few of them point by point. But it's very clear that the International Court of Justice only recognized nation states. So basically meaning that Gull Bay First Nation can't take Canada to the International Court because right now we're currently not recognized as a nation state. So that's the first thing. So that's a big limitation in terms of international law where Gull Bay can take its grievances. So if we're looking at some of the international concepts, there's 5 main ones. One being the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of occupation, the doctrine of adverse possession, and the doctrine of conquest, and the doctrine of cession. I know there's a lot of talk about the doctrine of discovery, and chiefs are asking that whether or not Canada would repudiate or renunciate the doctrine of discovery. And I'm all for that, don't get me wrong, but I don't think that'll ever happen. And the reason why I say that is that that is the legal foundation of stealing our lands. That is the legal foundation in which, under international law, they gain possession of our land. So for them to repudiate that would almost acknowledge that the lands weren't rightfully taken. So that's the first thing. The doctrine of occupation, we talked a bit about that, and that's where I think where they looked at certain aspects of terra nullius, and I understand Chilcotin decision completely rejected terra nullius. The doctrine of adverse possession did not apply in our situation. We've challenged the various aspects of adverse possession in our territory. And if you look at the doctrine of conquest, there was no conquest in Canada, much like other parts of the world, especially in perhaps the United States. But I guess where it may apply is under the doctrine of cession, under the treaties. So I think this is why it's so important that we look at that treaty relationship with Canada and so forth. And I know that First Nations are talking about sovereignty. And for me, sovereignty represents independence and statehood. If I truly want to be a sovereign nation, I have to have complete independence from Canada, Ontario, and I have to have my own statehood. So I think it's important that we have to recognize those international legal concepts. One of the I've always advocated was that as a First Nation, because we signed the treaty with the British Crown, that's indicative that we were a sovereign nation, and that's been already recognized in the Supreme Court of Canada in the Huron Nation case, the Suui case. And if we want to look at true nationhood, again, we could use various articles, various international instruments. And if you look at the Article 1 of the Montevideo Convention of 1933, there are 4 aspects that constitutes nationhood, one being a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and a capacity to interrelation. So I feel that all of our First Nations meet that criteria for nationhood. The fourth thing I'd like to talk about is some of the international legal instruments that we have at our disposal, one being the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, second, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the ILO conventions, and the UN Charter itself under Article 1. So that brings us now to UNDRIP. And as I stated earlier, I support UNDRIP in terms of its development. I do have concerns. Gull Bay First Nation makes it very clear that we have concerns about UNDRIP and C15, but it's a big step from Bill C-262. And we have to recognize that, there's been an evolution of Aboriginal and treaty rights in Canada. We went from no rights or very little rights at all to a personal and usufructuary rights, to certain treaty rights, whether that be hunting or fishing. And in 1982, with Section 35, then became constitutionally protected treaty rights. And since then, there's been many Supreme Court of Canada pronouncements which talks about our Aboriginal treaty rights. And some of those cases were very good, some were very bad. And now that leaves us to UNDRIP under C15. And it's nice to criticize, Bill C15. And it's nice to say, well, I don't support it. Or it's nice to say, well, I support it with reservations. And I think that's where I'm going, is that I support, Bill C-50 with reservations. But I think as First Nations across Canada, and in particular in Ontario, and in particular in our region, we have to look at that relationship. And where do we go from here? And I think it's really important that we have to really look at this bill in detail, do the necessary consultations across our territory, and if it can help your First Nation move forward on many of these aspects, I think it's going to be important for our communities. So again, I think we have a lot of work to do, and I commend the work that's been done by everybody on this bill, and I'd like to see us implement it, providing our rights are not undermined in that process. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now invite our next speaker, Chief Paul Cheese, please, if you can come to the assembly floor. Chief Paul Cheese, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah, just give me a moment. To see me?
Okay, good. To you.
Sorry, the sun is shining. I'm in my office here in the community in the Wolastoqey territory. Quay, Niltaliwas, Saugan Pulchus, St. Mary's First Nation in New Brunswick. I want to thank you for allowing me to speak at this forum, and thank you to the organizers for allowing all of our voices to be heard across this great land that we call home. And home is where our ancestors have left us the responsibility to, of course, ensure that we continue to hold the rights of our children and, of course, our elders. I'm here today to, of course, speak to all of you and to speak to the Bill C15 on behalf of my people, my community, my children, and, of course, our elders. Although the United Nations declared on the rights of Indigenous peoples had already been watered down to its minimum standards by various states at the United Nations level, St. Mary's First Nations did not support the Bill C-262 version of the UNDRIP. Our band members, myself, and my council have not been fully informed or consulted about Bill C-15 prior to enriching into domestic law. Therefore, we are left to wonder if the Bill C-15 version has been further watered down and weakened by defining framework that we have not been a party to, circumventing the procedural rights to consultation and participation in the decision-making process. St. Mary's First Nation supports the withdrawal of the Bill C-15 to allow for more discussion and participation of the proper right holders in the finalizing wording of the bill before entrenchment. We will not support a domesticated, watered-down version of UNDRIP, which has no distinct recognition for us as true nations of people as a reflection in our treaties, therefore resulting in a major threat to our inherent right. There has been no free, prior, informed consent given by St. Mary's First Nations for the support of the current bill, Bill C-15. It is disgrace of the negotiations and decision-making process for inadequate talks to be taking place in the midst of the worst pandemic experience in Canada over 100 years, especially on issues as important as our inherent rights and the rights of our children and our grandchildren. One size does not fit all. What is good for the West Coast does not necessarily work for the East. West Coast agreements should not be applied to everybody else in the country. Canada has no authority without free, prior, and informed consent of the Wolastoqey to unilaterally interrupt our inherent rights, suspend our original treaties for any length of time, decide who represents us in any negotiation process. Therefore, St. Mary's First Nations calls to withdraw the Bill C-15 until such time that the Wolastoqey Maliseet people be given sufficient time and resources to fully comprehend the bill and develop a plan that meets the needs of the Eastern Wabanaki with the full participation of our grassroots people, who are, after all, the proper right holders. On behalf of myself and Elder Alma Brooks, we want to thank you, Waliwin.
Thank you so much. I would like now to invite Saul Sanderson to come to the assembly microphone. Are you present, Mr. Sanderson? So we're waiting. Oh, you're there. Okay.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes, we can
Okay.
hear you and see you.
Okay. Thanks for the opportunity, by the way. I listened yesterday and this morning, and there's something I'd like to highlight. There's a failure to examine the current status of what governs our Crown Indian Nations relations. And that failure is resulting in a lot of questions being asked or a lot of misinformation being provided. Let me highlight that framework for you and what we need to do to implement what you're talking about having to get done by us. Yesterday and to date is what Parliament's doing, what the feds are doing, what the province is doing, and so on. Well, what do we do? If we're sovereign nations, what do we do to implement our sovereignty? Now, when we talk about that, there's a comprehensive legal political framework governing Crown Indian Nations relations. We never talk about that. And that existed even before the UN Declaration. But now we have the complementary support of the UN Declaration. How? And everybody talks about initiating, taking action to implement, but along with a new framework. Well, this comprehensive legal political framework governs the framework for everything we're doing, have to do. Now, what is that? When we talk about that comprehensive legal political framework, it governs our sovereignty treaty relations. It governs the nation-to-nation relations. It governs the government-to-government relations. It provides for the lawful political recognition of a formal government-to-government bilateral relations process, instead of going with this on issue of free, prior, and informed consent, not guaranteeing anything respecting consultation. I'll talk about that. But you see, it also provides for implementing our inherent rights by sector, our inherent title to lands and resources, implementing treaties and treaty rights in every sector. Now, what is that framework governed by? That framework is governed by our inherent sovereignty. I've never questioned the fact that we have sovereignty of our nations, but I've questioned what are we doing to implement it and how. And we need to discuss that fully, because bands are communities, and communities are political units of their respective nations. They're not a nation unto themselves. So how do we come together with respect to the interface of our government jurisdiction and law between the bands of our nations and between the nations that we have that make up AFN, for example? We haven't been implementing AFN. We've been stuck on implementing NIB Inc. A hell of a big difference between what AFN is supposed to be versus NIB Inc. Now, when we look at that process, then governed by our sovereignty of our nations and the Crown's assumed sovereignty, I didn't declare that. It's their own Supreme Court that declared that the Crown has assumed sovereignty. That's what they're moving on. Now, along with that comes the inherent rights I talk about, governing our relationship with the Crown. The other instrument is our international treaties, 1 to 11. We need to talk about the national powers of treaty making. What are they? I'll come to that. But then you see, along with that is the Royal Proclamation of 1763. When I met with the late Judge Dixon, a Supreme Court judge dealing with the patriation of the Constitution, I took my charts and information to him. He said, I agree. He said, those are royal instructions to us, our government and the Crown in Canada, that we have to implement our Bill of Rights under our royal instructions and under our laws through the Royal Proclamation of 1763. What is that Bill of Rights? He said. He said, it's recognizing your sovereignty of your nations, recognizing the national powers of your governments, recognizing your national powers of treaty making, recognizing the treaty making process between the Crown and Indian nations, recognizing all of your inherent rights by sector, recognizing your inherent title to lands and resources. That's what that Bill of Rights is under the Royal Proclamation. Never leave it out of the Constitution, he said. So we got Section 25(2) today as another instrument governing that Crown Indian nations relations, recognizing everything you're talking about. So then you look at the Constitution Act 1982. I was there from the start to the finish in London, England by myself for 3 weeks, dealing with the Section 35 having to be maintained in the 1982 Constitution. Why? Because it's a full box. And everybody told me, it's not a full box, it's an empty box. Well, like hell. The late John Tate phoned me one day, he says, Lougheed wants to put the word existing in the front of Section 35. I said, what's your problem? Oh, no problem, he said. I just want to let you know. Well, I said, let him do it, because everything exists anyway. He said, yeah. I said, I'll agree with you. He said, your inherent rights, your inherent sovereignty, your treaties and treaty rights exist, but your inherent sovereignty, your inherent rights are reserved, recognized, confirmed, and guaranteed by the treaties, as you always say. I agree with you, he said. They'll find out later it's a full box. So in London, England, meeting with the Committee of the Law Lords, I had to deal with that issue, and that's what I told them. But under your parliament and your government, you enacted the Royal Proclamation of 1673. So I said, look, it's a full box. So I went to meet with the Cabinet Committee of Foreign Affairs, dealing with the patriation of the Constitution. Same question came up. It's an empty box. I said, like hell it is, and I did give them the same explanation. So the chair said, what do we do? I said, you know what you have to do. If you don't pass the Patriation Act, Patriation Constitution of Canada with Section 35 intact, there'll be a major liability. It won't be a liability against the Crown and right of Canada. It'll be a liability against the Crown of England and Ireland. Okay, he said, okay, we'll phone the Prime Minister tomorrow morning. So then you look at the Royal Proclamation and its application, then Section 35, 1 of the Constitution Act. I listened to 2 days now on that issue. There's a failure to recognize the comprehensive nature of Section 35. And here's what it does. It creates a hell of a major obligation and jurisdiction for the feds respecting their relationships with us over and above the recognition of 9124 of the BNA Act. And all the current legislation they've passed, the Finance Administration Act, the Land Management Act, you go on with that. It's all under Section 9124 of the BNA Act. And I took Minister Bennett and Joe Wild and others on the task on that. So when they passed the Child Welfare Act, that's the only act now that gives legal effect to Section 35, but it does more than that. It gives legal effect to the UN Declaration as well. So then you go on to recognition of what else governs that relationship, that framework. Well, besides the Constitution Act 1982, we have the international laws that some of the speakers already identified. The Civil and Political Rights Convention, the Child Welfare Convention, Child Rights Convention. But we now have UNDRIP as part of the instrument that governs that comprehensive legal political framework. What are we doing? Now we have the UN Organization of American States Declaration as well. I just given you now the comprehensive legal political framework that's in place right now that governs our Crown Indian nations relations. It governs our sovereignty treaty relations. It governs our government to government relations, and it governs the implementation of our inherent rights and title, treaties and treaty rights in every sector. Now you hear about relationships, and one of the chiefs just raised it. What are the relationships? Where do we go with the relationships? Well, there's a lot of discussion on treaty relations yesterday and today. No discussions on what the relations are that are recognized by this comprehensive legal political framework. You got political relations, recognized in what form? Equality of government, jurisdiction, and law, and courts go across the border. tribal state government jurisdictional law, state government jurisdictional law and courts, Congress, federal jurisdictional law and courts. Now, you just discussed with one of the ministers and the previous minister, the justice minister, the recognition of our legal system, he said. We already have what you call a comprehensive inherent legal system that has been in place historically, and it applies today. But the resistance we have is ourselves in recognizing it along with our own jurisdiction under our government's jurisdictional law at every level. Why? That's what political relations is about. Now, I don't have to go into much more detail about treaty relations. You already had a lot of discussion on that. But what about judicial relations? Where's our own justice system and our own courts?
I'm sorry, I will have to ask you to conclude in 1 or 2 sentences if possible.
Yeah, I'm just about done.
Oh, thank you.
A few more minutes, because this is not an easy thing to deal with. And you look at the whole area of judicial relations, then that automatically kicks into place what the ministers were talking about. Kicks into place the need to address interface of government jurisdictional law, does it not? Yes, it does. When they talk about the English common law and the French civil code that they already have for interface of government jurisdictional law, now they have to add our law, our Indian nations law. And that's clear under the process of judicial relations under that framework. The other one is economic relations. Where's our economy? That's community-based, regional, national, international, under our own Trade and Commerce Act and our own Corporations Act and so on. Our own the inherent title to lands and resource act. Now, that takes us to fiscal relations. Nobody's budgeting has a major framework for budgeting, a major model for budgeting the financing of our governments. Everybody budgets based on contribution to funding arrangements that they get. It's time we develop our own Finance Administration Act that provides for government-to-government fiscal relations, government-to-government fiscal agreements, and budgeting our own financing of our needs for our governing systems in every sector.
I'm sorry.
Then the last one is international relations. So when we look at the international relations, we need to identify how we implement our own inherent rights and sovereignty. We define them, we list them, we define them in our respective languages based on our worldview, philosophies, traditions, customs, practice, and values. And their duties and responsibilities, our collective responsibilities to our people and our nations. And you look at the plans and strategies you have by sector to implement them. Then along with that comes what you do to implement through our respective unique and special laws under our governments and the federal government. So that gives you the bigger picture, and we need to elevate this whole agenda to what I'm talking about. Without that, you're going to keep talking and dealing with administrative agendas, and you're going to go nowhere. That's my recommendation. I talk about that because I've been involved in Indian politics since I was 15 years old. That says 63 years I've been involved in this business. And now we need to move ahead, and the lawyers that are talking and experts that are talking, it's time we turned our attention to what do we do and how we get it done. That's my example, and that's my position on what we need to do if we're serious concerned about implementing UNDRIP. And of course, a lot of good recommendations on amending Bill C15. Yeah, I said right from the start, there has to be a specific clause in there on how you terminate not just the doctrine of discovery and the 1830 detribalization policies that nobody knows about, the 69 white paper that's based on the 47 liquidation plan for Canada, now the 1980 Buffalo jump of Mulroney.
Thank you.
But last point then, my last point is, what about the papal bull, 1493 papal bull instructions that the empires went to validate their theft of our lands and resources? What are those instructions? Christian instructions says Indigenous people are not human nor Christian, because Indigenous people are not human, they don't have sovereignty and government. Because Indigenous people are not human, they don't have title to lands and resources, and they don't have rights. That's 1493, Chair, and it's 2021. Are we not still dealing with those same issues? You're damn right we are. So it's not enough to reject the doctrine of discovery that's already been done. If they don't reject that papal bull of 1493, you reject nothing.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for all the information you shared. And I will now check if Chief Wetong is still, she had her hand raised a bit earlier and I can't see her hand. So maybe you changed idea, or I just don't go to you if you still want to speak. And I will now turn on, I can see, okay. I will now call for Chief Willie Littlechild and will give over the facilitation responsibility to my colleague, Cedric. Chief Littlechild, to you. And Cedric, you can come.
Perfect. Thank you, Weena. So as we're bringing Chief Littlechild to the microphone, I just want to thank Saul Sanderson for his words. As the co-chair for the National Youth Council, it is people like you who are leading the way that have batted the trail for us. And like you said, we've got to fight the bigger fight. So thank you for your words and all that knowledge that you shared with us. And I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that. So now Chief Willie Littlechild would like to say a few words. Chief Littlechild, if you could open your mic and camera. And I'm being informed that we might also have a few visual aids to help us during Chief Littlechild's presentation, which is interesting. And as he's coming to the stage also, I'd like to remind everyone that's watching that in the Q&A section, you can ask questions, but also you can go see the last questions or all the other questions that were answered and asked prior to yours. So there's a lot of interesting discussion. We have Dan Belfort that gave a few very interesting points on treaties. We also have different things from Saul Sanderson, yes, and also Sarah Grace Ross, who's the Director of Justice at the Chiefs of Ontario, who spoke about having to look at all the alternatives and looking at the different positions. So if you've got a second, I'd go see this. But first, the microphone is to Chief Willie Littlechild.
Thank you very much. Migan Gakio, Kitamskadno. Asemi na pego, Mstaki Goyosi, and Mamopia, Ngaton. Seman Tonista, Migane Mamsian, in the Naskumok, the Kiska in Namagua. Exe, Absiso Meriats, Musianista, Kamikoam Skutamakum. Tansan Magesana at the Gitutamak, Kete Kayas. Aki uyas tamagoya kichoi chigeona. Ektoche tan sego hevni takikastak. Ogoma uskats uyasuon agamaski ka kiusitak. Egoma apsi sewiyadotama. Thank you very much, and I'll be very brief. I just wanted to illustrate an example of what we have done in listening to the discussions this afternoon. And the question is, what I said was at the beginning in my language, what was it that our forefathers agreed to? What was their understanding of treaty, in this case, treaty number 6? And how do we use that original spirit and intent of treaty and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples together? So when the adoption was made in New York in 2007, I asked myself the question, now how do we implement the UN Declaration? And we had an 8-step plan we designed for ourselves on implementing the Declaration. We didn't wait. We adopted the UN Declaration, acting as a sovereign Indigenous government. So we've had the UN Declaration for many years now, and we use it a lot. But I just wanted to illustrate how do you combine those two together, because the treaties, next slide please, the treaties, when you ask, what was the original spirit and intent of treaty, for example, on Indian government and nationhood? And what are the corresponding articles of the UN Declaration that support that original spirit and intent? What was the original spirit and intent of Indian institutions and administration, for example? And on the right-hand side, you'll see all the preambular paragraphs and the actual articles of the Declaration that support that 1876 and 1877 list of treaty rights. Next, please. So, as to lands, water, and resources, what was the original spirit and intent? And which articles, the preambular paragraphs of the UN Declaration support that? And you see that on the right. We used this next one yesterday at a meeting with the Minister of Education, the spirit and intent of treaty right to education. And we informed her that the preambular paragraphs and the articles, especially 14, is what we used at a meeting yesterday. And the spirit and intent to health, the use of traditional medicines, as outlined in Article 24 of the UN Declaration, and the right to a clean environment, to clean air, clean water, that's set out in Article 29 of the UN Declaration. Next, please. I'm going to go through fast here. The treaty right to social assistance, to police protection and extradition, the spirit and intent of treaty to economic development. Next, please. The original spirit and intent of treaty to hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering, and the right to food. The intent to treaty exemption from taxation, exemption from war. Next, please. Next slide. To the international boundaries, the J Treaty, for example, comes to mind there. The treaty to meet in council, the intent to shelter, the treaty right for the homeless. Next, please. The mutual consent of treaty making, which is now called free, prior, and informed consent. What articles support that? And they're listed on the right-hand side of the column. Implementation, which articles of the UN Declaration talk about treaty implementation? Is there a dispute resolution mechanism in the UN Declaration? Do you have to go to court? No, you use those articles that are listed on the right-hand side there, 27, 28, and 40. They create a conflict resolution mechanism. Next, please. And don't forget, as there are rights, there are also freedoms. Freedom from fear. And which articles of the Declaration deal with that? Freedom of assembly, worship, freedom from want, freedom from discrimination. So you see, what I'm trying to show you is that, like an eagle, on one wing are the original spirit intent of treaty rights, and on the right wing of the eagle lists the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it takes both wings to work together for our rights to fly and soar. I just wanted to show you this because that's how we use it. That's how we've been using it as recent as yesterday. It's in our Constitution, the UN Declaration. So it's up to us to use it. If you don't use it, you lose it, as the expression goes. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to show an example there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Littlechild. I like the imagery of the two wings helping the bird fly and how it needs both of them to come together. So really an interesting approach that helps us maybe comprehend that it might be a little more profound than just a few words on a page, right? So thank you very much for that, Chief Littlechild.
Thank you.
I'd like to draw the attendees' attention, and again, reminding you that you can raise your hand if ever you would wish to make a comment, speak, criticize, give any kind of comment that you want. But I'd like to draw the attention to the Q&A panel where Ron Ignace, and again, I'd invite you to come explain it yourself because I'm sure you can do it much better than I, but explaining how rather than applying or waiting for federal and provincial laws, his nation has started creating their own laws and applying their own laws, which are based on inherent rights. And one example he gives is the industry of mushroom picking and how we can see that they decided to put their own. But I see that Ron Ignace is actually ready to talk. So I will bring you to the stage. And once again, I remind people the Q&A is there. Ron, the mic is yours. You seem to be muted, Ron.
Hello. Hello.
All good. We can hear you now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can't see. I just got click. Oh, I guess launch meeting. Okay, just hold on here. Sorry. Allow.
We can hear you now. No worries.
Okay. And there's a leave or join on the screen, so I don't know which button to push.
For now, we click. For now, we click nothing. We've got you on stage.
Okay. Let me see where I got to get back to my Q&A. And so, yeah, I have, you know, we as Secwepemc, while yeah we fight, we have a title case going, and we support the push for UNDRIP, but we are not waiting around. We're beginning to stand up and implement our own laws and because the way I see it, the Aboriginal rights, the existing Aboriginal rights in the Constitution, unfortunately, to me, it's shrouded in common law. It as opposed to, whereas we have inherent rights that are pre-existing, and the outside of common law, because common law, as I see it, is ruled by kings, where that they define the laws and determine how those laws are going to be applied upon us. And the fundamental principles of common law is private property and individualism, whereas we as Secwepemc, our laws are pre-existing inherent rights that's founded on collective rights and kinship, and the importance of it being a pre-existing right. It's unfettered by the doctrine of discovery and colonialism, because it existed prior to that, and that's where we have to start in our discussions with Canada on a nation-to-nation basis, not on their interpretation of what our rights, whether it's in an empty box or whether the box is empty or whether it's full. All those debates, we say no, and we've begun to implement our own Secwepemc laws. There was a huge international mind that was to be established in our country. We looked at federal and provincial environmental laws and found them wanting. So we stood up our own Secwepemc laws and got our heads of families to be on the panel to make determination. And their decision was that the mine was a wrong mine in the wrong place. And the federal and provincial governments, as a result of our decision founded on Secwepemc law, did not issue a permit to the mine, hence a precedent of accepting Secwepemc law. In another scenario is that we had a big forest fire, and we knew that mushroom pickers were going to come in, and they are very destructive. So we stood up our own laws, by the way, with the regional minister of forests, sitting beside us of the provincial government. And we implemented our own laws, and we compelled the buyers and the pickers to buy permits for us before they could pick one mushroom, and that there was rules and regulations about environmental concerns and sensitive cultural heritage areas, including we also had got them to buy a permit before they could camp on our territory. And so, you know, we are not waiting. There are other ways and means that we're implementing our laws. For example, we're standing up a law before miners can come in and do exploration in our territory, that they're going to have to come through us based on our law, not through the provincial government. And more recently, under Bill C91, and we have to found ourselves on legal pluralism. And this is how I see the language law, Bill C91, is founded on legal pluralism. Now we have the opportunity and have had the opportunity to pass laws to govern our own languages within our language territories. With, like, for example, we as Secwepemc people will be moving to establish our own Secwepemc laws on how we're going to govern our languages within our Shuswap territory. So we don't have to wait. There are other, and we're moving on in other areas. And I think that is what we've got to begin doing, pushing the envelope by standing up our pre-existing inherent rights, not rights shrouded in common law, because common law, they can debate it and debase it in any way they see fit. But with the basis that we have to interface on is that our laws, we have to get them to pass laws not to give us our rights, but also their laws are laws that govern them on how they have to interface with our laws. That is nation to nation relations. And that is the direction that we're heading in. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Ron. I think it resonates a lot with the kind of feelings that were brought forward by Saul's comments. So thank you very much for that. We have Chief Harvey McLeod from BC, who is in our question and answer panel, explaining that it is a lot of information and that we're trying to absorb all this. So I'll remind people that if you do go to the C15 microsite on the AFN website, if you Google C15 AFN, it's the first thing that comes up. I tried it earlier. Near the bottom of the page, there's a lot of resources, and making sure that, again, I keep bringing this back up, that we have all the information that is needed so that we can make informed decisions. Today is one aspect of it, but also all those readings, all those documents that have been prepared for you, and looking towards some of the experts that we have, like Marielle Interpellafont, Chief Willie Littlechild, and Romeo Saganash, who presented to us in these past few days. I'd like to maybe open up the floor one last time, see if anyone has any comments, questions, going towards, I see what time it is, so it's getting to be the end of the day for most of us. And once we'll go through a final phase of who we can have and then go towards our closing comments. We have Ralph Leon, who I will be bringing to the stage right now. Ralph, if you want to open your camera and the microphone, and then the floor will be yours.
Thank you, Chief Ralph Leon Stales. Thanking all our other leaders for their tremendous words and history on our pre-existent inherent right to sovereign our land, our territory, our tribes. Stateless, we're independent. We're not in treaty, but that doesn't mean that we don't support treaty, or, you know, because we fully support everybody, all our brothers in Turtle Island. We support what you're doing, but here in Stateless, we're in negotiations with RA, with Canada and BC, and we're allowing them into our territory, and we're allowing them to mend in our basket of knowledge, our old laws that have been here since 9000 BC. you know, that's how old our territories are. And I love the elders' words earlier, but here in Stales, we utilize it as a basket that I'm holding in my hand. That's our basket of knowledge. And that's also the basket of equality that needs to be in place. Our matriarchs, patriarchs have those laws already embedded. So we need those that assumed jurisdiction blend it in and make it ours, just like you all are doing. And I love what you guys are doing. And with that, I didn't want to talk really long, but you know, I loved all the words, and I'm a young chief, and I'm always learning. It's too bad that we're in this pandemic where I can actually go and visit, you know, and be able to hear Harold and all you guys do a phenomenal job, and keeping us in line. And you know, even though that, you know, we want to talk, we want to be heard, you know, but it is what it is. We are in pandemic, and soon enough we'd be able to come and meet in our own BC room, the Alberta room, you know, all those good rooms that are created for us. And so I just wanted to say good work on the UNDRIP, you know, the UNDRIPA, all that good work that's coming up. You know, we're going to make it ours. We got to own it. Let them implement their laws that are very young 153-year-old laws. They're very young. So with that, ACM, thanking you, the AFN staff, and those that are speaking for us. ACM, thank you.
Thank you, Chief Leon, for those words. Again, opening it up to anyone who wants to make final comments as we're going towards the end of our day. It's a lot of information. I know even my brain is a little fried right now, and I've been trying to keep up as much as I can with C15 and everything that's being done. So I can imagine you with the responsibilities that you hold. Opening up the floor for a few final comments as I'm waiting to see if anyone would like to raise their hand. We have Judith Sayers in our Q&A who's also would like to add that the use of the word systemic racism would be needed in the action plan, because systemic discrimination may include it, but it might not be strong enough and not as direct as it is. And she's referring again to section 6.2AI. So just for those, you will find that in the section in the Q&A. We have Chief Wilfred King who would like to make final comments. Chief King, microphone's yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank everybody for today's session. Chief Wilfred King, Kiasaging, and the Shnabek Gulbe First Nation. I think what concerns me is that you know, we have a lot of disagreement, or some disagreement, amongst our First Nation communities, and even some of the territories. There's disagreement on how we proceed and whether or not it's a good bill, a bad bill, or an indifferent bill. But what concerns me the most is the political dynamics in this country. As we can see in British Columbia, you have a government that's receptive to this bill, and other parts of the country where premiers are outright rejecting it. My concern is that if there's a change in the federal government, the next government may say, no, we're not interested in proceeding with this bill. And you might have even the Senate opposing it. So I'm just afraid that, you know, we'll take one step forward and 4 steps back, you know, so that's a concern I have, because, you know, our country is governed by Parliament and by provincial legislatures, unfortunately. And it would be really sad to see this bill die because there's a change of government federally, or, you know, provincial governments don't adopt it. So it's just food for thought. Miigwech.
Thank you, Chief King. One final chance to get your words in on this forum on Bill C15, trying to get this dialogue moving forward towards, again, informed decisions. We have Chief Joel Abrams, who's making a comment on recognizing rights under Section 35, and how either it comes through court battles or by negotiating through the colonial non-assertion technique policy, and that's seeing how the AFN, with respect to UNDRIP, could lay out conditions. Again, this is found in the Q&A section. We also have a few comments that were made by Councillor Beeswax on the rights and also the processes that are brought forward. So I bring your attention to those again. And waiting final call. I feel like someone at an auction once, twice. If not, I'd like to invite my co-facilitator, Lena Siwi, for our closing comment.
Merci pour l'invitation, Cédric. Alors, on est rendu à la fin de la journée et pour ma part, je termine en vous félicitant toutes et tous, l'ensemble de vous, pour votre grande écoute pendant autant d'heures et à travers des outils informatiques comme Zoom. C'est vraiment incroyable. Alors, bravo à tout le monde. Pour ma part, j'ai trouvé ça extrêmement intéressant. J'ai appris beaucoup. J'ai écouté, évidemment. J'ai appris beaucoup. Je suis honorée d'avoir été des vôtres, car c'est un dialogue extrêmement important pour tous, pour l'ensemble des Premières Nations dans ce qu'on appelle aujourd'hui le Canada. Alors, l'objectif du dialogue national était de donner la chance à la majorité de personnes de pouvoir écouter le point de vue des autres et de pouvoir aussi transmettre, partager sa perspective. Et je pense qu'avec tout le temps qu'on a eu, cet objectif a été atteint. Et c'est pas rien parce que si on regarde le nombre d'intervenants qu'on avait, le nombre de personnes qui avaient des choses à dire et tout ce qui a été dit, bien, pour ma part, je pense qu'on a fait un grand pas. Alors, sur ce, j'aimerais maintenant inviter le chef national à s'adresser à vous pour ses remarques de clôture. Est-ce que le chef national est maintenant dans la salle? Au microphone de l'Assemblée, pour utiliser les termes que l'on connaît bien, mais qui ne s'appliquent pas au virtuel. Alors, National Chief, are you in the room? I'm inviting National Chief for final remarks. Et pendant que le chef national se joint à nous, j'aimerais encore une fois prendre le temps de dire un grand merci pour votre participation. C'était très apprécié. Merci beaucoup. Alors, on m'informe que le chef national s'en vient dans quelques instants. La magie du virtuel nous le fera apparaître dans quelques secondes, peut-être. Alors, je pourrais passer le temps. Je ne sais pas si vous avez vu la vidéo de l'avocat qui était dans une salle avec un juge, une salle de cour et qui avait un filtre de chat. Ça m'a fait bien rire. Alors, une chance, ce n'est pas arrivé ni hier ni aujourd'hui, mais c'était quand même bien drôle. Je ne sais pas si vous l'avez vu, mais c'est partout dans les médias. Ça s'est passé aux États-Unis, je crois. Et l'avocat qui était déguisé en chat, qu'est-ce qu'il a fait? Il a accusé sa secrétaire. Pas gentil, ça. Alors, vous comprendrez que j'essaie de remplir un peu le temps parce qu'on a un petit problème technique. Et puis, comme je n'ai pas ma certification d'humoriste, je vais m'arrêter ici. Alors, est-ce que quelqu'un souhaiterait, est-ce que mes coéquipiers, mes collègues souhaitent prendre la parole? I don't know, maybe Harold, you want to say something, or Cedric, because we have time.
The joys of online presentations, eh? But honestly, I think I just want to repeat the words. Might as well take this time as a co-facilitator to thank you guys for your participation. The amount of work that has been done and that needs to be done too, we are very aware of it. This whole meeting was in response to what happened at the AGA, and we're hoping that as leadership, you feel a bit more informed, that you feel like your voices are heard, and that you have the information that you need to start digging further if that's the point, or making your choices and where you as leaders in your communities and your nations will be going forward and bringing this message to your people. So I just want to say thank you. Again, you guys were very kind with us as facilitators for everything that you did with respecting the time allotment. And at the same time, just for your participation. We do know it's a very complex situation. We go into the depths of the rights of Indigenous people with this kind of bill. But at the same time, it's an important discussion that we had to have. We have to start it, and we can get to go forward and do other things. So
hey,
now
Cedric.
I'd like to present National Chief for his closing remarks.
Sorry about that, Cedric. And I was listening all day, but I was in a wrong room, so they had to rejig me into this one. And but anyway, it worked out. Again, just to acknowledge the all the speakers in the last few days, because I've, like you all, have listened to all the speakers, the presenters, the chiefs, the leadership, the technicians, the politicians, all related to Bill C15. So nista kinanaskom tinawa kakio. Kakia okimaka na kinanaskom tinawa pepikskir apsisi uhuta. Kakio kiteyak tapemiasin for your prayers, to the elders and the chiefs for their words. I thank you all. I want to, you look at the first day on our agenda, and I'm not going to, chiefs and to the participants, I'm not going to take a long time. I'm not going to regurgitate what you heard, but it was so nice just to listen in, you know, and I do have to thank our chairs, no question, you know, to Cedric and Weena and Harold, thank you so much. Good job as always. And I look back to the first day, and I think about the information from Romeo Saganash. Thank you so much, Romeo, for laying that groundwork through Bill C-262, the private members bill. That laid the groundwork. And because it was a private members bill in the Senate, they delayed it, maneuvering, right? So it died there. And there's a lot of support for C-262 across Canada as a way to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So Romeo Saganash, thank you so much. You're a strong leader, Nochagan, Tapla Miasin. Thank you so much for your leadership there. And then for Chief Willie Littlechild, you know, to come and speak again, because he was a chair of our legal team, our legal counsel team for our AFN. And he has such a vast history and experience, not only on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but on treaty and our relationship with the Crown. So Willie, thank you so much for chairing our legal team, and providing that expertise, and how they both fly on that eagle's wing, the treaties and the UN Declaration, how we're trying to keep going in a good way together. And of course, to Mary Ellen Trappel-Lafond for her good comments and her assessments and her quick mind, you know, a strong champion for our people right across Canada. I thank you so much, Mary Ellen, for your leadership and your work. And then we focused on BC, and some will say, well, it was a BC-centric agenda. But we tried to show all the people from across Canada. And we wanted Ross Montour from Kahnawake, you know, for his viewpoints and his line about, we're good at taking meat off the bone, we got to put some meat on the bone. And he's referring to Bill C-15. But his strong message about jurisdiction and the inherent rights that we all have as First Nations people. And then we went to BC, so Chief Terry Teegee, Chief Shara Casimir, and Cookby Judy Wilson, because in BC, they convinced a provincial government, so Premier Horrigan and Minister Rankin, to implement the DRIPA for that provincial piece of legislation there. And so we wanted to learn from them and listen. How was that achieved? And we also heard it's not all rosy there. We heard from Judith Sayers, President Chief Judith Sayers, about it's not a perfect world in British Columbia. There's still a lot of work to do on the action plan and working together, the joint decision making. So we learned from them all. And then today, from the speakers, you know, and we had Minister Lametti. And this is where it comes into the chiefs and the delegates listening. It's been introduced for first reading in the House of Commons now, Bill C15. Because I stressed on day one, that's the only mandate we had at the Assembly of First Nation was to get a Liberal government bill that is as strong as Bill C262. So we pushed that and we have that in place now. But we've heard some concerns and issues on how to make it better. Everything from the law and if it's enacted, the law and policy review that should be enacted in place if it's passed, Bill C15. The action plans, 3 years is too long. Look at a shorter time period. And make sure that the rights and title holders are involved. That's what it's all about. We can advocate and we can lobby as organizations, as the Assembly of First Nations, but it's the rights and title holders to help drive these things forward. Use the word systemic racism throughout the bill. Don't just on the side reference it. Use specific wording. Be clearer on the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. And we heard concerns over the federal government's consultation process, that it wasn't adequate, and that there's other provinces and territories and First Nations leaders that want a proper consultation process because of free, prior, informed consent. And so we need to be mindful of all that. And then we heard comments about the Non-Derogation Clause, how important that is. And what does that impact and mean for inherent rights, Aboriginal rights and title holders, and treaty rights? And then Chief TG's line on free, prior, informed consent. That is a place where we can make decisions together. That was a good statement. And so, friends and relatives, everything that we heard over the last 2 days, there will be a report from this. It'll be summarized and it'll be on AFN website and we'll get it out to the participants. There's no question. This bill, from our understanding now, in February, will be introduced in that House of Commons for second reading. And then there's a process, goes to committee, third reading, and then it gets out of that House, then over to the Senate. And then there'll be changes and amendments through that process, on its way to royal assent. And some of the chiefs picked up on this point about, will it get passed in time under this Liberal government, or will this Liberal government fall, and then this bill will die on the order paper? Then you got to start all over again. So there's a bit of a fear and risk on that. So we said we'll try to do this, but in a good way. And so from December, when we ran out of time to discuss Bill C15, that was the push to have a 2-day forum, which is what we've just concluded. So to lift up everybody and thank them for their words and comments. And even today, listening to the chiefs and Senator Saul Sanderson, I was smiling when I was listening to him, going all the way back to the Papal Bulls of 1493, you know, the detribalization policy of the 1830s, the 69 White Paper, the Buffalo Jump of the 1980s, all these things. It reminds us again that we are nations within a domestic state now called Canada. And the most important right we have, that is inherent right to self-determination. And because we have that right to self-determination, we're able to consecrate treaties with that country called Great Britain. And so just thinking of all the leaders I listened to, from George Manuel to Walter Dieter to John Tatusis and John Skiboss, Old Gambler, treaties trump policy, treaties trump legislation, nations make treaties, treaties do not make nations. All these words are so powerful. And so we have lots of work to do. And I know from the pre-Confederation treaties, the two-row wampum treaties, the Treaty of Niagara, Robinson-Huron, and we lift up those chiefs there because of the annuity win, Robinson-Superior, the Victorian treaties from 1 to 11, the Douglas treaties in BC. I always hang on to this quote from 1897, J.G. Curran, that these treaties should be governed by international law rather than domestic law. Powerful statement from the Solicitor General of Canada. So we have lots of work to do. There's no question. And it is, Section 35 is a full box of rights. And we're going to keep pushing for governments to recognize that full box of rights. And I've said it this way, that if we're going to have this word called reconciliation in Canada, then our jurisdiction and our laws need to be recognized as well. Common law and civil law is recognized. One day we will also see our law, First Nations law, natural law, creators law recognized. And we have to be the ones